Childhood Memories. This is a collection of stories written by some of the older residents of Girton during the coronavirus pandemic of the early 2020s. They are read by Margaret Hyde and Graham Jones. Here we are in 2021, and more than a year has passed since the coronavirus pandemic began to spread around the world. Many people have been locked down in their homes for months, shielding themselves against this virus. Elderly and chronically sick people living alone have suffered more than most during these long periods of isolation, and in some cases, their mental health has deteriorated. People in their late 70s and older will remember some of the rigours and restrictions on their young lives caused by World War II. They sheltered from bombs, their food and clothing was rationed, fathers were away fighting, many never coming home, and much more. Now in their senior years, they have faced another world war, fighting this horrible virus. In an effort to alleviate some of the loneliness, boredom and mental frustrations of the long lockdowns, older people have been asked to reminisce and write down some stories of their childhoods. Club 55, Age UK CAP and Girton Parish News have worked together to produce this souvenir compilation of those stories. We hope you will enjoy listening to them. Young people of today will remember the restrictions placed on their young lives by the virus. They will remember relatives whom they lost because of it, and how they missed out on some of the fun of their youth and young lives. They should, however, take some solace from the fact that they did not have to sleep in air raid shelters or underground stations whilst bombs were falling about their heads and destroying their homes. Nor did they find themselves evacuated, living miles away from their homes with people whom they had never met before, some never returning to their houses or seeing parents again. Let's hope for the young people of today that they will never again have to face the horrors of war or pandemics. A note from King George VI was handed out to school children in 1946. I wonder if school children will get a similar note from our monarch when the war against the coronavirus has been won. King George VI's message. 8th of June 1946. Today, as we celebrate victory, I send this personal message to you and all other boys and girls at school. For you have shared in the hardships and dangers of a total war, and you have shared no less in the triumph of the Allied nations. I know you will always feel proud to belong to a country which was capable of such supreme effort. Proud, too, of parents and elder brothers and sisters who by their courage, endurance and enterprise brought victory. May these qualities be yours as you grow up and join in the common effort to establish amongst the nations of the world unity and peace. Signed, George R.I.
Old Girton. Born and brought up in Girton by Margaret Sharp. I was born and brought up in Girton and was 9 years old when the war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939. Prime Minister made the official declaration that England was at war with Germany at 11 a.m. on that Sunday morning. Instead of going to church or playing in the garden, The whole family gathered together to hear this special announcement on the wireless. When the war was declared, a general blackout was called for, and ladies hurried to Cambridge to buy dark linings for their curtains. Some people had wooden shutters made for their windows. In the summer, gas street lights had been fitted in Girton, but they were never lit because of the blackout. During that autumn of 1939, evacuee families arrived from the East End of London. Everyone helped to find accommodation for them, but Girton was too quiet, and they returned to London, sadly in time for the German Blitz of 1940. The evacuees were replaced by airmen who came to Marshall's Aerodrome to learn to fly. They were allocated accommodation according to the number of bedrooms in a house. Sadly, of the 12 billeted on 16, our house on Girton Road, only one survived the war. Everyone was called to the Women's Institute to be fitted with gas masks. The mask came in a cardboard box with a long string handle, and people were expected to carry them at all times. Soon, Macintosh covers were being sold to protect the boxes, but gradually people stopped carrying them and left them at home. Iron railings were taken from around the churchyard and the Apothecary tomb next to the church porch. These were to be melted down for armaments for the war effort. As the church windows were not covered, evensong was moved to the afternoons. For early morning services, there was a tiny spotlight over the altar. The rest of the church was in darkness. My father used a torch to find anyone there in the time of the collection. The Reverend Tucker did some of his visiting on horseback. There was no fuel for civilians to run cars, except for doctors and nurses and others with important roles. In 1940, there seemed to be a constant sound of aeroplanes from Oakington and other airfields nearby, whether training planes from Marshall's during the daytime or bombers at night. They then returned in the early morning. We used to count them going out, but sadly the same numbers never seemed to return. Buses did not run on Sundays to save fuel, so only walking or cycling got people to church. There was no fuel for the mower to cut the grass on the recreation ground, so Dr. Stewart at Girton Gate on Huntington Road kindly offered Girton Tennis Club the use of his tennis court, which was cut by hand. A weekly mother and baby clinic was established on Wednesday afternoons at the Women's Institute. Nurse Billiquet and a doctor would be in attendance. Voluntary helpers gave out the government-provided orange juice and cod liver oil, and helped with weighing babies. Nurse Billiquet had seen the birth of most of the babies, as home births were the norm. The blacksmith continued to work from Smithies Green opposite the church, where there was a permanent forge to provide new shoes for the horses which worked on the farms. Luke Cole came with his horse and cart to collect unburnable rubbish. People had bonfires to burn anything else. A homecoming fund was set up to help servicemen when they returned home at the end of the war. If they did not return, the money would go to their families. Girton Town Charity gave the elderly a sack of coal at Christmas, but with rationing the coal was no longer available, so the charity gave 10 shillings to the elderly instead. Maids disappeared to war work, so local older ladies took up house cleaning. Ladies who were not working would gather together to knit for the troops, or tied pieces onto netting to make camouflage for the army. Rationing of all consumables was introduced, meaning that very careful cooking had to be done in all households, and of course things like fruit, especially bananas and oranges, and sweets completely disappeared.
Growing Up by Graham Clare. I moved to Girton in late 1945 when I was 3 years old. I had just met my father for the very first time. He had been called up to join the army in April 1942, before I was born in the November. It was a great occasion when he returned. Thankfully, he was physically unscathed. As for me, I obtained my own war wound when I was 2. A dog I stroked on a daily basis suddenly took a dislike to me and bit me on my right wrist. I was too young to blame the dog, and anyway, it was probably feeling hungry like the rest of the population on war rations. I have that scar to this day. When we moved to Girton, we lived in a bungalow in a cul-de-sac in Woodlands Park. My father had helped to build the estate prior to World War II. He was a glazier and once told me he had put every pane of glass in every window and door in every house and bungalow in Woodlands Park. I wonder how many of those panes are still in situ all these years later. There was quite a gang of us children in our two cul-de-sacs. We didn't have very much by way of material things, but we did have each other. We used an old rope for skipping. We had one small two-wheeled bike, which all of us learned to ride. One tricycle, one pedal car, and one scooter between us. We shared everything we had. And yes, we had our arguments. Of course, as Christmases and birthdays came and went, we gradually increased the availability of playthings. What we didn't have, we made. Pieces of wood became stilts, cricket bats, rounders bats, and handguns used when playing cowboys and Indians. We had a wonderful playground, long gardens leading down to a brook, and access to woods and fields beyond. We also had the street, as there were few cars around then. We had no televisions, no record players, just the radio. Programs like Dick Barton's Special Agent, Take It From Here, Raise a Laugh, The Goon Show, Two-Way Family Favourites were all programs that got the imaginative juices flowing. And then television came along and spoiled it all. Truth was, we spent more times outdoors summer and winter. We had no central heating, so it was as well to be outside as in. Frozen curbside puddles became brilliant slides. Not that our parents took too kindly to that, as it didn't do much for the soles of our shoes. Hopscotch, marbles, football, goals being marked by laying our coats on the ground. The road was our pitch. Cricket, wickets being a nearby telegraph pole. We had electric street lamps, the first in Girton. These had a globe on top, throwing out a five-pronged shadow onto the ground, on which we played shadow tig for hours. We were never bored. We kept chickens for eggs and for the occasional Sunday dinner. And of course the feathers made brilliant headdresses for those of us that played Indians. The chickens attracted rats from the brook, which made a good target practice for our catapults. Better still, when I received an air gun as a present one Christmas. As rationing was still in place, the gun also came in handy for shooting rabbits in the fields located on the other side of the brook. If we didn't get any rabbits, we would buy one from Sainsbury's, where we also got our ration of butter. Barkers of Oakington delivered bread 3 times a week. Butlers delivered meat on a Wednesday and Saturday. And once a week, Brown's hardware van came round, mainly for people to buy paraffin for their heaters, which complemented their coal fires. Milk was delivered daily from one of the 3 dairies situated in the village, one of which was Mr. Chandler, who pushed a milk churn around on a handcart, and you took your jug to him for filling. Eventually, Chivers and the co-op began deliveries, and the small dairies disappeared. We often supplemented our Sunday breakfast by walking across 2 fields from our home to the golf course, where we gathered the best mushrooms ever. As we grew older, we began to wander away from our homes to play. Washpit Lane was a favourite, as it had the brook, the woods and open fields, still has. We started school in Cotton Hall, as there was no glebe school. There were 3 classes in Cotton Hall, one in the cookery room, long since gone from near the entrance to the recreation ground, and one in the village institute, now the social club, which is where we also went for our school dinners. We played football on the recreation ground. A man who lived in Church Lane, who was a qualified soccer coach, had an allotment at the back of the recreation ground. He would often appear with his wheelbarrow laden with tools on his way to his allotment, but would stop and join us. After a couple of hours, he would take his wheelbarrow and return home, no doubt convincing his wife that he had been hard at work on his allotment, when in fact he'd been attempting to turn us into soccer stars of the future, and in a few cases succeeded. We had to earn our pocket money, running errands for our parents to the local shops, Huddlestones for greengroceries, Ingles for general groceries, and the co-op if all else failed. We went gleaning, picking up ears of corn that the binder left behind when cutting the fields. These we took to the local farmer for a small but welcome payment. Then he bought a combine harvester, and that put paid to that. Then we discovered that if we followed the combine when it was cutting the field alongside the golf course, we could pick up all the golf balls that had failed to reach their targets. There must have been some pretty lousy golfers at that time, as we managed to find buckets full, which we then took to the secretary of the golf club for a small payment. Well, a pittance, really. We joined the ABC Miners at the Victoria Cinema in Cambridge, where we watched our equivalent serial to EastEnders, Gene Autry and the Thunder Riders. As we became teenagers, we formed the Youth Fellowship, a kind of youth club but attached to the church. We had a Saturday evening club held in Cotton Hall, where we played snooker, darts, dominoes, draughts, and danced, mostly the girls, to the latest hits. We formed a skiffle group and called ourselves the Worried Men. I've no idea why, and we didn't make Jukebox Jury, which was a popular television program at the time. We had the occasional outing to such places as Southend and Great Yarmouth. Many romances began at this time, and some, including my own, have lasted for many years. As a teenager, I began to take an interest in motor racing, particularly the Lister Jaguars that were built in Cambridge and driven by Archie Scott Brown. Archie owned a petrol station and garage located at the Swainsley turn on the Huntingdon Road to Cambridge Road, which was then the 604 and now the A14. I often stood in my back garden and would hear Archie as he took off from his garage and drove through Girton on his way to Cambridge. Imagine my delight when I left school at the end of 1957 and obtained an apprenticeship at Lister's, working on the Lister Jaguars. Not only did I meet Archie on a regular basis, but the chief mechanic of the racing team was Edward Barton, obviously called Dick. Back to the radio days. Bliss. Just after starting work, I had my one, and I'm glad to say only, brush with the law. One evening a week, I had to attend the technical college, which was located just off East Road. One winter's evening, cycling along East Road, My front cycle lamp, which was battery powered, was giving off a glow to the equivalent of one candle power. I was banging the lamp in an attempt to make the light brighter, which caught the attention of a nearby police officer. He dutifully stopped me and discovered that not only did I have a front light that was not as good as a glow worm, but I didn't have any brake blocks in my front brake because the front wheel was buckled and someone had nicked the reflector from my rear mudguard. I was reported for all the offences and summoned to the Cambridge Juvenile Court on my 16th birthday. I was asked what my weekly income was. Now I had to be a bit cute because as an apprentice I got a wage rise each birthday. So on this day I was earning more than I was yesterday. So guess which one I quoted. You've got it. I was fined 5 shillings or 25p for each offence. That might not seem much, but it was a third of my weekly wage at the time. I got no sympathy from my father. He just thought that as an apprentice engineer, I should have known better, and I ought to have a bike in good working order. And of course, he was right. Years later, that police officer became an inspector. I would like to think that I made a small but expensive contribution to his promotion. Happy days.
A Very Happy Childhood by Evelyn Fryer. I was born in 1948 at the Evelyn Nursing Home, pre-NHS. My parents, sister, aunt, mother's sister, and her son, father still on active service, all lived together in Thornton Road, then a new housing development. I had a very happy childhood shared with my cousins who regularly stayed, their parents coming at weekends. We used to sleep on army camp beds with rough army blankets over us. Our garden was mainly taken up with growing vegetables, soft fruit, and apple, pear and plum trees. We had our own area which we tended carefully and competitively. We all had bicycles and shared a 3-wheeler trike. My father had a car in which we went on holidays. Thornton Road was a close, friendly community. We played tennis in the road, walked on homemade stilts, skipped in groups, and spent our time generally popping into each other's houses and gardens. I remember watching the Queen's coronation at number 30, with several neighbours crammed in to view the event, as they were the only family that had a TV. We walked or cycled to school in the village, stopping sometimes at Ingles, the post office and sweet shop, or Mrs. Graves at the nursery, who sold flowers from her back door. The co-op, still in the same place as it is today, had an amazing till system which whizzed around the ceiling to a cashier sitting higher up, who returned your change the same way. We also stopped to feed the animals at Cole's farm. I'm not sure of the owner's name. Alas, no longer there, as we have the A14 bridge. Ron from Barker's, the bakers, called with a huge wicker basket for you to choose your bread from. Butler's, the butcher, delivered once a week. Porters came with vegetables, but the highlight was the Corona man with bright orange, green or red top bottles of pop to choose from. The Wellbrook Laundry was a white single-storey building with a glass-pointed roof fence which sent clouds of steam hissing skywards. Lots of lorries pulled up at the front delivering mountains of white sheets from colleges and hotels. We caught the bus for Cambridge from Girton Corner, which turned around there in the lay-by. When walking along, the top of the bus could be seen before getting to the stop, so my mother would scoop my sister and me under each arm and run to catch it. Not very comfy. If we cycled, we left our bikes in an open garage in the yard beside the house at Girton Corner, putting 1 penny in the box. If it was busy, you had to remove several bikes to uncover yours when you returned. There were several huge Nissen huts standing where Thornton Court is now. They had concrete slopes leading to them, great for riding bikes up and down. I think they sorted clothes for the war effort there. We played in the woods where Thornton Close is built now, swinging from a rope across a stream to our den. We spent what seemed like days there. My sister and I both attended Brownies and Guides, competing for most badges. We used to meet in a wooden hut where Redgate Road is now. Susan and I both attended Girton Glebe School. It was a very new building. The headmaster was Mr. Foote. At lunchtimes, all pupils went on to the rec to play, with Mrs. Adams looking after us. My father, with several other dads, helped to build a swimming pool in the grounds. It proved very popular and was the envy of neighbouring villages. It's still going strong. The Reverend Leighton, the vicar in the 1960s, also ran the youth club at weekends. We spent many happy days and evenings cooking, painting and dancing in Cotton Hall. Sunday afternoons were spent on the rec, listening to the Top 20. I'm still in touch with many old neighbours and friends made in Thornton Road when it was first built, although sadly they no longer live there anymore. The Impey, Monkman, Parr, Logan, Cowell, Larman and Flavel families springing to mind.
Time spent roaming the village, recalled by Paul Fletcher and ghost-written by me, Graham Jones. Mr. Paul Fletcher, born 1938, expressed an interest in submitting some recollections to the Girton Memories Project. I had a long and interesting phone conversation with him, and am now writing, accurately I hope, some of Paul's recollections. Paul was born and spent his early years in Cherrybounds House, on the corner of Hicks Lane and of what was to become, years later, Cherrybounds Road. This was of special interest to me because I live in Cherrybounds Road, and Paul told me lots of the history and development of the area. At the rear of his house, i.e. down the future Cherrybounds Road, stood his father's wooden shed and garage, where he kept his lorry. This lorry was used to convey fruit to Histon railway station for onward transport. The fruit, apples, cherries of course, beautiful yellow plums, came from the orchards at the end of the eventual residential estate. The lorry had other uses. Paul's father had a coal round and collected the coal from the Histon goods yard. Paul took the opportunity of talking to the engine drivers and enjoyed rides on the footplate. Pigs and chickens were kept in the area, with styes and sheds where pig swill was boiled. Jumping ahead for a moment, Paul returned from national service in 1960 to find that a builder, Mr. Pask, had turned the land into the residential Cherrybounds Road. An enterprising family, Paul's mother had a wet fish van. Paul remembers his mother travelling to Grimsby in 1947 to negotiate with fishermen, and thereafter collecting fish boxes from Cambridge Station. Paul's and his friends' boyhoods were times of outdoor freedom, roaming the village, knocking on doors and running away, making bows and arrows and catapults, playing hide and seek, coming indoors at 6:45 p.m. for Dick Barton's Special Agent on the radio, and then back outside. Memories of the late wartime years. A German plane crashed on the golf course. Paul and his pals were first on the scene before the authorities and took pieces of perspex from the cockpit hood as souvenirs. It was possible that the dead crew was still in the plane, but Paul wasn't certain about that. He remembered a searchlight on the wreck. The captain of the searchlight unit travelled from his post from Norwich. Paul is still in touch with his niece. One of Paul's friends was Andy Lee, who was to become an international motocross rider and who had a motorcycle business in Cambridge. Paul remembers Andy riding his motorbike along the rounded top of the wall between St Andrew's Church and the wreck, an indication of his potential competitive skills. Paul's schooling started at a private school in Thornton Road. Next came Park Street School, travelling into Cambridge on the 129 bus. Then the county school, where the headmaster was Mr. Newton John, whose singing daughter Olivia Paul met just once. Paul was a member of the first aid section of the cadets. He bunked off school on that infamous day in 1953 when Hungary beat England 6-3 at Wembley, the start of the decline of our international standing. Remember Pushkas, the galloping major? This was another shared experience. I missed school that day too. A more angelic activity was Paul's membership of the Trinity College Choir. Paul and his pals undertook the huge task of transforming the rough land of the eventual Cherrybounds Road into a full-size pitch for football and cricket. His gang took on other gangs of Girton lads at these sports. On occasions, the cricket ball had to be recovered surreptitiously from Hicks Lane Gardens. Graduating from practising against his garage wall, Paul became an accomplished sportsman, playing for Girton football and cricket teams, and at county youth level, and for Granta Cricket Club. He remembers how Girton Football was the first club in the area to install floodlights for evening training. Floodlights of a sort, electric bulbs in crisp tins on poles. There were so many memories arising from Paul's enthusiasm for sport. In 1947, he and his best mate, John Mansfield, together with Maureen Rowney, who was just 15 or 16, set out at 6:30 a.m. and cycled to Lord's, arriving at midday to find Dennis Compton and Bill Edrich at the crease, the former approaching his century. The temptation to hitchhike home was resisted. John and Maureen eventually married and celebrated their diamond wedding late 2020. Was it liking for John or for the cricket which induced Maureen to cycle on such a journey? Playing for Cambridge Wanderers, Paul scored a century on Parker's piece and, in accordance with the customary marking of such a feat, was awarded a miniature bat inscribed with the signatures of the great touring West Indian side, including the magnificent 3 Ws, Worrell, Walcott and Weeks. It was on Parker's piece that Jack Hobbs, the great English batsman, played his first representative match. A sporting type, Paul played rugby for the county school's first 15, although his first love was soccer, not played at the school. My own experience too in Birmingham. In his mid-teens, Paul joined the Girton Baptist Church and remembers with great respect the minister, the Reverend Mr. Nixon. Mr. Nixon was buried in the parish church graveyard, and Paul tidies the grave from time to time. Walking near St Andrews today, I found the Reverend Nixon's grave neatly tended and with flowers. Finally, some filling in of Paul's biography. His first job after leaving school was with Chivers. Paul did 2 years of national service, 1958 to 1960. He married in 1967. His 3 sons became a banker, a golf pro, and a manager with John Lewis. In 1975, his job took Paul and family to Oxford. They returned to East Anglia after 10 years, settling in Bury near Ramsey. They still keep in touch with Girton friends and acquaintances.
Memories of Girton by an almost lifelong resident. Girton Endowed School was the village school based in what is now the Cotton Hall, with Mr. Garner as the headmaster. Some classes were also held in the old Working Men's Institute, now Girton Social Club, where the pupils used to go for school dinners, which were prepared on the premises. Sunday school classes were also held in the Cotton Hall. In 1946, Girton Endowed School celebrated its 100th birthday with speeches and a cake. In 1951, the school's status changed from being a church school to a county primary school, and it moved into the new buildings at Girton Glebe School with Mr. Foote as headmaster. The Brownies were run by Mrs. Riley and her daughter Gillian. These were held in the Conservative Hall, a wooden hut in what is now Redgate Road, before all the houses were built. The Guides were run by Mrs. Channell and her daughter Sonia. Ballet classes were held in the WI Hall in the High Street. They were run by Diana Grant, another Girton resident who lived in Woodlands Park, who also worked at the Arts Theatre. In the 1970s, a baby clinic and a Tufty Club, road safety for children, were run from the WI Hall in the High Street. Next to the WI Hall, there was Huddleston's Nursery, a plant nursery. In the 1950s, old-time dance classes were run by Mrs. Baker in the WI Hall. Concert parties were held there, run by Jim Ison, also visiting local forces camps in the area. The Wellbrook Laundry was based in Girton Road, near Wellbrook Way now. A lot of people in Girton worked at the laundry. Other businesses were Sid Ingall's shop on Cambridge Road, near the end of Redgate Road, which was attached to his house. The house is still there. His wife ran the post office in the same building. Before that, the post office was in the High Street opposite the WI Hall. There was also a dairy, a Newton's Dairy, in the last house on the left on the Oakington Road. At the top of Dodford Lane lived Bobby Hallows, who painted his whole house red, blue and white for the Queen's coronation in 1953. Before that time, the house had been a sweet shop, and before that it was a pub, the White Horse Inn, which was founded in 1760s and closed in 1910. Coming back into Girton, there was Mitcham's Undertakers just after the Baptist Chapel, which used to make their own coffins, and in the 1960s, a little shop at 101 High Street, Sarah Jane's, that sold baby clothes and knitting balls. Ray Watson ran a barber shop from the front room of his house opposite the church, next to what is now the Hibbert Ware Garden. There was a blacksmith up to the early 1950s opposite the church bus stop, where horses were shod. In 1964, a developer demolished a bungalow at number 39 Hicks Lane and built 2 houses, opening up the way to develop what became Cherry Bounds Road. Before that, it was open land with a very large fruit orchard. Cherry Bounds Road is the only road with that name in England. It was the boundary of the orchard. Very happy childhood memories. A wonderful village to live in.
Old Cambridge. Memories of 1940s and early 1950s by David Bacon. I was born in January 1940 being the youngest of 4 siblings, myself, a sister, and 2 brothers. My family were Londoners. In September 1939, my sister and eldest brother were evacuated to Great Shelford as a result of the Second World War. My parents and other brother remained in London, and shortly afterwards, my mother and brother were also evacuated to Stapleford, taking up residence in a small 2-up and 2-down cottage. My father, who was hall keeper and verger at a church in Stoke Newington, remained in London for the duration of the war, and also undertook the duties of an air raid precaution warden, advising people during the blackout, and also helping to recover injured and the dead from bombed properties. This took a heavy toll on his health, and I cannot recall him undertaking employment after he joined the family in Stapleford. The cottage my mother and siblings were housed in was very old. It had gas for lighting and cooking, but water had to be obtained from a tap in the next door's garden, and there were no waste facilities. Whatever was carried in had to be carried out. Bathing was in a tin bath in the living room, in front of the range in winter, with water having to be heated either on the range or on the gas cooker, a long and quite dangerous operation. And then the bath emptied by means of a bucket or scoop, a real effort for my mother with 4 children in the family, and me, a newborn baby. The toilet was situated in the garden and consisted of a bucket, the contents of which had to be buried in the garden at very regular intervals. Fortunately, the garden was very large. Other cottages with a similar problem dug a very deep hole, and when full, would dig another one and move the toilet structure over it. Some of my friends were quite scared of using the latter option. Visits to the toilet had to be well planned. In winter, you got freezing cold and had to rely on either a small oil lamp or candle, which often got blown out at the most inconvenient time. Come to think of it, it wasn't that pleasant if the weather was hot. In later years, we had the bucket emptied by a man with a lorry, at least one unpleasant task down. The cottage had been furnished with items from the Red Cross, Women's Institute, or other village organisations, although I was not in a position to know this at the time. It must have been a great shock to my mother, who had come from a large house in London, and one with all mod cons. It was fortunate that the family did move from the London house, as at some time during the war it was bombed and reduced to a pile of rubble. Other families who lived nearby were not so fortunate. As stated, I was born in Cambridge in January of 1940 at 48 Bateman Street, which was a home for unmarried mothers. An interesting situation for my mother, who had been married for 14 years, and I was her 4th child. It accepted normal maternity cases because of the war. Over the years, I've been reminded by members of the family where I was born, usually with great hilarity if non-family members were present. Due to my age, my recollections of life during the war are somewhat limited, but I can recall troop movements in the village and airplanes from nearby RAF Duxford. I also recall watching the bombers forming up for what I now know as the 1,000 bomber air raids. As a 5-year-old, I went to Stapleford Primary School, which consisted of 2 classrooms and the nearby village institute, with 3 female teachers. I can remember the 1/3 pint bottle of milk, with sometimes concentrated orange juice and rosehip syrup. Malt was also provided, and although some did not like the taste, I did. Lunch was provided at the school, and although aware of rationing, I do not recall going hungry. We had vegetables from our garden, and neighbours would give us their surplus. Village life consisted mainly of roaming across the fields and in summer down by the river, fishing mainly for minnows or sticklebacks, paddling and swimming. I recall going to Sunday school, although I suspect it was as much so that I could go on the annual outing as a desire for religious instruction. I was also, for a few members, a member of the church choir. I don't think I had a great voice, but I like to think I added to the numbers. And if you sang at a wedding, a little cash came your way. There was also the Boy Scouts and Village Youth Club. In the evenings, we read books or comics, played cards, or listened to the radio. With no electricity in the house, the radio, which had large valves visible at the back, was powered by a large battery, which was quite expensive, and an accumulator, which had to be taken to the bicycle repairman for recharging. You also needed a long aerial strung across the garden to ensure reception. A mobile cinema used to visit the village on occasions and set up in the village institute, and was well attended. Later, I was able to go to the Spicer's cinema at Sawston. It changed its programme 3 times a week, unless they had some important film, when they would be shown for 3 nights. Sawston Village College also had a good selection of evening classes, and free transport was provided. In 1951, I passed my 11 plus and took up a place at Newport, Essex Grammar School, travelling daily by train. The days seemed long, as I had to catch a train at 8 a.m. and did not get back to Shelford railway station until 5 p.m. In the winter, often much later, when the steam trains were delayed by fog. I never quite understood how a Cambridgeshire resident I was sent to a school in Essex. During my 5 years at Newport, I can only recall a total of 4 boys attending who lived in Cambridgeshire, 3 from Sawston and 1 from Whittlesford. During the latter years of sweet rationing, I did a good trade in exchanging coupons for sweets, as my sister, her husband, and other adults gave me their sweet coupons. The end of rationing brought this little enterprise to an end. Whatever the reason for my being sent to the Newport School, for the greater part I enjoyed my time there. We remained in the Stapleford cottage for 15 years, moving out on my 15th birthday to a brand new council flat in Great Shelford. It had hot and cold running water, electricity, a bathroom, and flush toilet. What a wonderful change from all those years in the cottage. Although looking back, I have to say that for the greater part, they were happy years. And at least in those important early years, we were relatively safe from being bombed. Many others were in the same or even worse situation than us, and had the family remained in London, it is quite possible I would not be writing about my early life. Our new flat was little more than a mile from the cottage, and our Stapleford connections remained for many years. Despite my family having originated from London, none chose to return there. We, the 4 siblings, all married local partners, as did our respective children and grandchildren. The extended family have chosen to live close to Cambridge, and I believe that if you were able to cast a net 15 miles in radius from the centre of Cambridge, you would be able to ensnare the whole family.
Outings in the 1940s by Val Burrows. In wartime, outings had to be restricted to our local area on the whole. Generally speaking, we rarely went outside Cambridge and either walked or travelled on the 106 bus. So we would walk with Mum to the backs of the colleges to sit on the grass and make daisy chains. We'd admire the carpets of crocuses and daffodils and stop to watch the goats behind the railings by the road. As Mum had a keen love of nature, she would draw our attention to the beauty of a wild flower, bird or insect. In those days, the range and number of wildflowers was so vast that it was quite in order to pick a bunch to take home. I remember people cycling back home from Madingley Woods with bicycle baskets full of bluebells. Mum had a lifelong passion for flower pressing and would supervise the making of pressed flower booklets, one of which won me a prize at Park Street School. Walks with dolls' prams would take us as far as White House Lane in Girton to pick violets for Mother's Day. We once had a family walk from Oxford Road, where we lived, to Girton, when some of the aunties and uncles were home on leave, which made me aware of my father's absence. One walk has unsurprisingly remained in my memory. I was walking along beside the pram my mother was pushing along Madingley Road when a truck stopped for the driver to ask the way to the American cemetery. "I've a load of guys to take there," he told Mum in an American accent. I picked up the emotional expression on my mother's face and her tone of voice when she tried to tell me how sad the matter was. Storey's Way was a quiet road that holds some happy memories for me. I went to Richmond Road School, and Miss Chandler, the head teacher, used to take us to Mrs. Salter's farm at the dead end of Storey's Way, where we would enjoy climbing a haystack, among other activities. At Richmond Road, we also had an annual May Day celebration in Mrs. Golding's garden on Huntingdon Road, at the corner of Westfield Road. It was a pageant of colour, with all the children dressed in springtime outfits and flowers, especially the May Queen. One of my 6-year-old friends, Sheila, sat in her wheelchair that was bedecked with flowers as her throne when she was our May Queen. I still remember the songs we sang and dancing round the maypole. Gran and Mum frequently took us to the Folk Museum, now the Museum of Cambridge. I was always particularly interested in the antique dolls, prams and cradles. Enid Porter, the curator, was a close friend of my Auntie Mari, so if Enid was away, Auntie would take her place on a chair at the top of the winding stairway. Crossing over the road to Castle Hill usually followed a museum visit. We loved to climb the hill and look across towards Ely Cathedral. When the war ended, my father came home and a whole new chapter began in our lives as we spread our wings to discover the wider world outside Cambridgeshire. But exploring our close environment gave me a love for Cambridge that has remained throughout my life.
War in the Fens, A Flood of Memories by Sam Clift. The war was over and there had been celebrations. Life was getting back to a state of normality. Many things were still on ration, but the blackout rules had been relaxed and street lamps were being lit for the first time in my life. I remember the lamplighter cycling along, travelling from lamp to lamp, lighting the gas mantles in each one from the ladder he carried with him. I had been born in 1938, about a year before the beginning of World War II, and knew only life as it was during that period of conflict. I was an only child, but was part of a very large extended family. Mother had 3 sisters and 9 brothers, whilst father had 3 brothers and 4 sisters. Most of these aunts and uncles were married or courting. Some, like my parents, had children, and if my calculations are correct, the total number of relatives came to, shall we call it, a lot. Only 3 members from this extended family saw action during the war, and funnily enough, 1 was in the army, 1 in the navy, and 1 in the WRAF. We were a family of Fen people, brought up living and working on the Fenland farms and at a comfortable distance from the constant bombing occurring in our towns and cities. Our men were important workers growing food for the nation and were of a reserved occupation, so not having to go to war. Planes crashed on the lands. We worked with prisoners of war, and Land Army girls helped us, but the bombing had been at a distance. We were, of course, rationed and had to abide by all the wartime rules. But we had a good living. We ate pheasant, partridge, rabbit, hare, wild duck, and chicken. We grew our own vegetables and fruit, and gathered wild berries and mushrooms in their seasons. We had extra rations from the government to counter the physical work carried out on the farms, and compared with many people, we had a good life in the Fens during the war. But our fight was about to begin. We lived in a bungalow in the corner of a field, about half a mile away from our nearest neighbour, and the nearest village was 2 miles away. From our home, we could see the horizon in all directions across the open flatlands and huge skies of the Fens. Other houses were sparsely dotted around the landscape, and only the occasional willow tree broke up what would have been a flat and uninteresting view. The great River Ouse was about a mile to the east, and the 100-foot drain and the washes were to the west, about 3 miles across the fields as the crow flies. Denver, where the Great Ouse and the 100-foot drain meet, was to the north, leaving us in the middle of a triangle of rivers. I had just celebrated my 8th birthday, but even at that young age had become used to the hard winters that we experienced during that period of the 20th century. The winter of 1946-7 was exceptional and particularly hard. I don't remember the exact date, but I do remember waking up one morning early in 1947 to a completely new landscape. The Fens were covered in a deep layer of snow. I had never seen so much, and the views were wonderful. The Fens, being so flat, allowed the snow to blow across them, and in blizzard conditions, the dikes and drains filled quickly as the snow took refuge in their shelter. In the lee of bushes, trees, and gateposts, the snow had drifted in those biting winds, making the views even more spectacular. Father had to go to a farm about a mile away to collect water, ours being frozen solid, and he took me along with him. We had to walk, and having donned our Wellington boots, set off, Father carrying 2 empty galvanized pails, supported on a wooden yoke placed across his shoulders. It was a real struggle to walk in that deep snow, and extremely difficult to cross the snowdrifts that had formed across the road. There were very few vehicles about at that time. Even if they had been around, they would have not been able to get through those drifts. We were on foot, struggling to get through the fresh snowdrifts that were as deep as my waist in places. We eventually reached our destination, gathered our water, and returned home. It was a few days later when a warm front moved in from the Atlantic Ocean, causing a sudden thaw across the whole country. Already swollen rivers were inundated with vast amounts of water from the melting snow. The saturated and frozen ground was not able to absorb any water, and the worst flood for over 200 years was about to manifest itself. Vast amounts of water were directed onto the floodplains of the washes between Erith and Denver Sluice, but the Great Ouse continued to rise, as did other nearby rivers. These included the Nene, which travels through Peterborough and Wisbech, eventually going out to sea beyond King's Lynn. This was all happening during the month of March, at a time when the high tides of spring are expected along the east coast. These tides at their highest would prevent the rivers from emptying into the sea, and even at low tide, it was difficult to get rid of enough water to relieve the pressure on the rivers. Water in the Great Ouse rose higher and higher, and flooding began to occur well beyond the town of Bedford, and all the way through Huntingdonshire and Cambridgeshire and into Norfolk. The situation around Ely, Littleport and Southery was getting desperate, with some of the highest water levels ever seen there. Special meetings were set up to try to control this vast amount of water, and the riverbanks were being constantly patrolled. The men of the fens were working furiously to fill sandbags to heighten and strengthen banks that were at breaking point. My father spent many nights patrolling the banks of the Ouse, looking for any danger spots and the weakening of the banks. I remember him taking me to Station Road at Littleport, where sandbags had been laid all along the road to stop the water from the floodplains of the Littleport moors washing into nearby houses. I clearly remember standing on that road in my Wellington boots, watching the water seeping through the sandbag wall and disappearing across the road down into the lower-lying fens there. Mother and father were extremely worried about the bank of the river to the east of us, because should that have been breached, a huge torrent of water would have been released across the fields towards our house, and we would have had little chance to escape it. Things were getting very dangerous indeed, and the army was called in to help the fen men fight what appeared to be, at this time, a losing battle. The whole countryside was being affected by what was happening along the Great Ouse Valley and in the fens. Then the unthinkable happened. The riverbank between Littleport and Southery was breached and washed into the fens, taking millions of gallons of water with it and flooding a huge area of good farmland the size of the county of Kent. Fortunately for us, the river had burst its bank on the other side from us, relieving pressure on the bank on our side of the river, but causing huge amounts of damage on the other. Wildlife and farm animals were drowned during the worst of the floods. Rabbits, lucky enough to get to a tree, managed to climb into the branches and survived by gnawing at the tree's bark. The power of the water rushing out from the river washed a large section of riverbank away and knocked the end of one house down, leaving it in a precarious condition. Houses and farms were flooded. The Fenmen faced an enormous task. They needed to repair the breached bank and get the river back into its bed and normal course. It was a bitterly cold gale blowing across the fens, and the flood water was whipped up into waves, doing even more damage. The men worked in these dangerous, bitterly cold, windy, wet and muddy conditions by day and by night. The riverbanks were struggling to contain the huge amounts of water being forced into the rivers beyond Bedford, and the men were in danger of being swept away should the bank they were working on give way. The force of the water pouring through the breached bank was terrific, and anything in its path was immediately washed away. Men fighting to close the gap in the bank sank a World War II tank and anything else they could find into the gap in an effort to block this violent and powerful torrent of water flooding more of the fens. Eventually, a brave tugboat skipper was able to take his tug and barges down the river from Ely, somehow managing to control his boat in the powerful and fast-moving current. His bravery in doing so allowed a barge to be sunk in the gap, and with the help of sandbags and the tenacity and determination of the fen men, the torrent of water was brought under control. The fight continued for many more days until the waters began to recede. This was a national disaster, and King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited the scene to see for themselves the devastation and to congratulate the Fenmen who had put their lives on the line to defend and save so much of their fens as they could. Since these devastating floods, more defences have been built and new rivers cut. So let's hope that there will never be another flood disaster of this magnitude in the fens. I remember those floods and the fen men who worked desperately in those wild, freezing and desperate conditions to control a desperate situation. And I am proud to have known them and to be a fen man myself. I hope I would have their resolve, tenacity and determination if ever I were faced with such a disaster. Time had passed, and the constraints of war were diminishing across the country. The disastrous Fenland floods had receded, and peace was settling in. New technologies, fast-forwarded as a necessity during the war, were beginning to emerge in Civvy Street. But we continued to live in our bungalow in the corner of that field. No electricity, gas or running water. Our fuel was wood, coal or coke from the gasworks in the winter, paraffin in the summer. We caught rainwater from the roof and stored that in a 200-gallon tank at the side of our bungalow to be used sparingly when needed. I often think about that water when I visit the drinks aisle of the supermarket. I look at all those bottles of water flavoured with a hint of lemon or some other exotic fruit, and then I think of the water from our tank. It was very meaty, full of gnat larvae in the summer, and flavoured with a hint of the pigeon poo that had washed down from the roof. Perhaps that's why fen men are so tall. The farmer just down the road had a large greenhouse with double doors at each end. It was wide enough for a horse and cart to drive through, and to allow the storage of rows of potato chitting trays on each side. During January, tons of Scottish seed potatoes would arrive in sacks to be transferred to the wooden trays, which were then piled 10 feet high along each side of the greenhouse. There they stayed until little green shoots, called chits, began to appear, and it was time to plant them. Potato planting, or as we knew it, tater setting time, always coincided with the Easter school holidays, and it was a time for us young lads to help out on the farm. Primrose and I were designated the task of dibbing, the placing of equally distant indentations in the soil into which the seed potatoes could be placed. The distance between each of the potatoes was important, both for economy of the seed and later when the seed germinated to avoid overcrowding of the plants. So equally, dibbing was an important task for a young boy. Primrose was a huge Shire horse mare, and she couldn't have cared less about how many taters were set or how they were spaced. She was just interested in going home at 3:30 for her dinner. Every morning she would be harnessed into the dibber. This was a machine with shafts for the horse to pull it and 3 very large iron wheels at the rear. These wheels were spaced to fit exactly into the bottom of the potato ridges. Located and adjustable on those iron wheels were a number of egg-shaped spikes which made indentations into the soil as the wheels went round. Primrose and I would arrive in the field to find that it had already been prepared with granulated or farmyard manure, and that ridges had been drawn out for the potatoes. We would walk up and down the field, following the ridges, with Primrose pulling the dibber, which in turn left indentations in the bottom of the gullies. Each time we travelled the length of the field, we left 3 rows dibbed, so it was necessary to get a good head start on the women workers. They arrived at 8 a.m. to do the planting, and there could be as many as 8 or 9 of them, so once up and down the field for them was 3 times up and down for Primrose and me. The chitted potatoes were brought by horse and cart from the greenhouse to the field in their chitting trays and handed down to the women workers. The trays were long enough to fit nicely on the top of 2 adjacent ridges, leaving just 1 gully down the middle. The women would work in groups of 2 or 3. If there was an even number of women, they would work in 2s, and if the number were divisible by 3, in 3s. If the number was odd, but could not be divided by 3, they would always be in pairs with just 1 group of 3 on one side of the group. It wasn't complicated. 1 tray would be held by 2 women, each holding one end with one hand and planting the potatoes with the other, leaving the gully down the middle for the 3rd woman. Working in pairs, they would overlap the rows. It was hard, back-aching work for the women, who worked for 6 hours a day with only a half an hour's break to take lunch, or in Fenland terms, docky, a term thought to originate from the early 1800s, around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. During that time, The fens were first used as a breadbasket to feed our troops abroad. Rich farmers told their poorly paid labourers, "If you stop work to eat food, I shall docky that time and money from your pay." Docky became docky time, meaning that it was an unpaid time when meals were taken. It was later, at the end of those Napoleonic wars, that the fenmen of Little Port and Ely rioted and secured better pay, but not before 5 were hung at Ely, and many others sent to Botany Bay, never to return. For Primrose and me, it was a leg-aching 8-hour walk up and down the field on that oh so tiring, soft fen soil. It was a great childhood, hard work at times, but always in the open, fresh air, with plenty of exercise to enjoy and wildlife to see, and above all, no worries. At bedtime, there was no need for sleeping aids.
Mother Kept Her Family Together by Pearl Clift. I was born about 1 year after the outbreak of World War II, my birth being registered in the Fenland village of Christchurch. I lived with my mother, father and siblings in an old house on the outskirts of March. Our family was by no means well off, and things were to take a turn for the worse when father packed up all his belongings and left the family to fend for themselves. I was just 4 years old at the time. We never heard from him again until we learned of his death some 37 years later. I recall that we lived in that old house for much of my very young life, but can't remember much about it, other than one day I was sitting on my brother's lap when there was a loud boom and our living room door burst open. My brother got up and closed the door, only for it to burst open again at the sound of a second boom. Some bombs had been dropped nearby, but I was too young to remember any more about that incident. Mother, left on her own with a family of 5 to look after and fend for, struggled to keep our heads above water financially. I would have to walk to school about 1.5 miles away, and to do that, to cross the railway lines. Quite often a train would be stationary across the road, and my brother and I would crawl between the trucks to continue our journey. Sometimes my brother and I would play truant and spend the day sitting on a concrete bunker, playing with our dinner money and waiting for the time to pass so that we could go home. Mother had had a child out of wedlock by a man who ran off abroad when he found out that she was pregnant. Some few years passed before he returned to England, and somehow their association rekindled, and we as a family eventually went to live with him, Mother as his housekeeper. His house was adjacent to the old Bedford River at Welney. It was a 2-up, 2-down house with no running water, gas or electricity. And from the upstairs bedroom window we could see the water in the river and had views across the nearby washes. The house was in a poor state of repair, with no plaster on the walls, and the stairs were simply a ladder. There was no bathroom, and everyone washed from a bowl on the kitchen living room table. The toilet was a wooden affair over a hole dug at the bottom of our garden. We had an old battery-operated radio, but it had no case coverings, and the workings were always on display. Financially, we were very poor, and I recall Mother would buy my sister and me a pair of Wellington boots each to last the winter, and brown sandals to last us all summer. We had no other shoes. When times were very hard, Mother would cut the sleeves out of an old cardigan or sweater and sew up one end so that we could use them as warm socks in our Wellingtons during the winter. As a young child, I would go pea-picking with my mother, who always told me that I was her lookout, but what I was looking out for, I don't really know, maybe German spies. As a family, we had very few toys. I remember an old rag doll and a toy sewing machine, but not much else, apart from some new child's handbags that my sister and I had for Christmas, and which we were very fond of. Both handbags came to a sticky end, though, when my mischievous brother poured treacle in one and jam in the other, spoiling them both. We found hoops and cut sticks to bowl them along, and made whips from some toy tops that we had, and played games that we made up. My brothers would catch pike from the river, so we quite often had fish for tea, and of course we grew our own vegetables in our garden. We used tin milk when we didn't keep a nanny goat, kept chickens for their eggs, and caught wild rabbits for their meat. In the summer, when our rainwater tank became empty, we drank water from the river. My mother made sure that we didn't go hungry, but that must have been a real struggle for her. Sweets were on ration, but even if they had been freely available, we never had pocket money to buy them. Mother would take us with the local Sunday school outings to the seaside once a year, and to the March Status, a fun fair held in the streets there, but we never went to the cinema or any other entertainment. It wasn't until I grew a bit older that I managed to earn sixpences from my brothers for ironing their shirts, and was able to work on the land picking potatoes to earn some pocket money. I was 15 when I left school and left home to go into service as a maid, struggling through life until I found myself living and working in a convalescent home, where I learned my trade as a housekeeper. I had a hard, poor, but happy childhood, and I give my mother great credit for keeping her family together. Air Raids, World War II, Memories of Air Raid Shelters, by Pamela Cressy. I was just 9 years old when the first air raid siren sounded, and for the next 5 years it was important to know where the nearest shelter was. I was with my brother, 17, and sister, 12. Our parents were not there for us, so we had to be responsible. For the first year we lived in Cheam, Surrey, on the flight path of the German bombers returning from raids on central London, who released any bombs still on board. It was part of daily routine after walking to school past destroyed houses to go straight down the sharp-edged concrete steps to a large, cold, damp hall with 60 other girls and our teachers. The exciting memory I have is of a large glass jar of sweets, which was handed round at intervals while we had our lessons. Everyone must carry their square cardboard box containing their gas mask, which must be with them at all times. Back at home, the cupboard under the stairs was cleared and fitted with cushions to provide some protection when the sirens signalled an air raid. The rockery down the garden was dug up and an underground shelter constructed. The smell of paraffin and of wet earth and concrete still brings back vivid pictures of this snug home with blankets, pillows, a tiny paraffin lamp on a shelf in the corner of our refuge, with dire warnings about the risk of fire if we touched it. The walls and roof were of corrugated iron, covered over with rockery. The floor was of concrete, occasionally flooded. Sometimes the winter snow got in. One of the treats was to venture out of the shelter to climb the plum and apple trees for delicious fruit, feeling daring to leave the rockery. At night we had tiny torches to guide us safely down the garden, but must observe the blackout rules. Sometimes we enjoyed moonlight. The next-door neighbours had a much posher shelter with electricity and food supplies, and when the maid was on her own, she would invite us there for tea, a great treat. At Christmas we visited relatives in London, where there was only a Morrison table shelter for 6 of us. It had a metal floor, strong netting sides, and very thick metal top. It was about 6 feet square and table height. I hated it, and claustrophobia in small spaces remains with me. As I was the youngest, I had to crawl in first, and 5 others squeezed in to be safe overnight. On rare occasions in central London, we saw the platforms on the underground strewn with blankets for people sleeping there. My sister and I were evacuated to Oxford, and I don't remember any shelters there, but when we returned to Cheam in 1944, the time of the doodlebugs and V2s, This time we were bigger, so would not fit in to sleep in the garden shelter. So every night we trudged up to the nearest public block up the road with our blankets, pillows and torches. It was a large brick-built building with thick concrete roof and about 20 iron bunks with mattresses and squeaky springs. It was dark when we went in each night at about 10 p.m, lights out, and very smoky. Several strangers were coughing and strong-smelling cough sweets were rattled out of tins. We found it difficult not to giggle at the inevitability of the ritual. During the daytime, we could see and hear the doodlebugs, unmanned bombs with flames streaming out behind. If they went silent, you had to dive for shelter. Sometimes we were in the British restaurant having a good home-cooked food, and all the customers had to clamber under the tables, preferably with your plate of food, until the all-clear siren sounded. The V2s were more sinister. They came much faster, and the first you knew was the explosion as they fell, and smoke and debris were to be seen rising up into the sky. It was all part of life. No wonder, then, there were such celebrations on VE Day.
Memories of the War by Graham Jones. I was born a year or so before World War II started and have a few childhood memories of the times. Here are a few. My father wanted to enlist for the Royal Navy, but because he was a manager of a factory which made war material, his boss would not allow him to go. I was told years later that his nerves became bad in the last couple or so years of the war, fearing for his family as bombing threatened Birmingham. Every evening, when he got home from work, he bundled my mother, myself, 4, 5 or 6 years old, and my baby sister into his little flying Standard 8. I think his boss wangled him some petrol coupons. He drove to Earlswood, a village about 6 miles outside Birmingham, and there we spent the night sleeping in the car. I remember that approaching Earlswood, there was a hump-backed bridge, and it was our ritual as we approached the bridge to chant 1, 2, and a jolly good 3. The last coming as we experienced in our tummies the descent on the far side. I was told years later that our neighbours resented my father's abandoning the home each evening. If a bomb had hit our house, they would have had to deal with it. There was a large lake at Earlswood, and years after the war, Dad used to take me fishing there. We used to drive over that same bridge. Before we started that nightly exodus, we used to retire to an Anderson shelter at the bottom of the garden. Dad had constructed 2 sets of bunk beds inside, and I seem to remember it was exciting to retire into the shelter each evening. I vaguely remember that, knowing there was a bowl of juicy plums in the house, one night at the height of an air raid, I insisted that Dad should leave the shelter, go into the house to get me some plums. When the war was over, my friends and I loved playing in the Anderson shelter, inside, what a den, and on top. And I can remember helping Dad eventually to dismantle it. He threw a brick at a rat that emerged, killing it. I'll mention just one more memory. Looking out from an upstairs window during the day, I watched a house whose garden backed onto ours ablaze. A German bomb had hit it the night before. The reality of the war hit home.
Childhood Memories by Phyllis Somerton. My earliest memories were when aged between 3 and 4 years old, and the war had started. We had an Anderson shelter at the bottom of the garden in London where we all spent each night, and I could see a gun on a factory firing at enemy planes. In the morning we would return to the house and my sister would pick up shrapnel in the garden. I used to collect caterpillars which were in a jar in the shelter. One night they got out. I don't think the family were very pleased. In the daytime I was told to look out for the black barrage balloon, as it meant enemy planes were approaching and we had to go into the shelter. My brother and sister were at school and were told they were going to be evacuated to Wales, but before that happened, my grandfather, who lived in Cambridge, wrote and said if they had to take evacuees, then why not come to them? We did, and that is how we came to be in Cambridge. We stayed with them for a time and I went to St Philip's School. However, my mother's father, who was with us and was getting older, wanted to be in Seven Kings, where his wife was buried. So my mother took me and my grandfather back and we were there until he died. We then returned to Cambridge and my mother started looking for somewhere for us to live. We moved to the Broadway on Mill Road. It had a flat roof and I remember my father used to fire watch at night in turns with other residents. While there, I remember watching from the doorway lots of planes droning over and was told afterwards they were going to Coventry. When I was 7 to 8, I had infantile paralysis, polio, and I was in part of the Leys School which had been taken over by Addenbrooke's Hospital. I was there for 8 weeks and was lucky to get over it. When I went home, my parents bought me a small bike to strengthen my legs, and I would ride with my father, and if there had been an air raid the night before, we would ride out to see the bomb damage. I also went to tap dancing and ballet classes, and we did shows round the villages and Papworth in the summer in the garden for the people to watch from their balconies. When the war was over, we had a street party with fancy dress and tables down the middle of the street where we could eat, and it would all be great fun. Rationing was still on, and I was told to queue for bananas and other things when they became available in the shops. I loved chocolate, and I had to put a square on the corner of the mantelpiece for when my father came home, but I nibbled the corners off, so he had a round piece, not square. We never went back to London, and so I've been in Cambridge ever since. I shut my sister in the chicken run. Sheila Greenfield. My name is Sheila Greenfield. I live in Cambridge, but was born in Farnham, Surrey in 1938. I remember a lot about my childhood, which was a happy one, even though it was wartime. My father worked hard to keep his family fed and clothed. It was hard, but he did the best he could, and we all came out the other side just fine. There was a time when I shut my sister in the chicken run. She was scared of anything with feathers, so she should not really have been down where they were. I pushed her in and locked the gate and left her there. My mum asked me where she was, and I told her she was in the chicken run. She raced down there and let her out, and of course I got a good hiding for it. When I first started school, I went into the infants. Our teacher, Miss Carter, was a tyrant. When she shouted, the whole village heard her. In winter, she put our milk on the radiator to keep warm, and when we got it at playtime, it was all thick and creamy. It was horrible. I don't drink milk to this day, except in tea and coffee. Where we lived, we were in the line of the doodlebugs going over at night, and my dad would stand at the back door watching them going over, waiting for the engine to stop. They were making for London, of course. When I was still very young, the sirens would sound at night. When I was in bed, I would be taken out, wrapped in a blanket and taken to the air raid shelter. It was very cold down there. I caught whooping cough because of it and still suffer from it now. Games we played were whip and tops, rolling a hoop up and down the road, and a long skipping rope with someone turning at each end, and about a dozen of us skipping together. We had the time of our lives. Sadly, my dad passed away when I was 9, and I still miss him today. By the time I was 13, we'd moved to Cambridge to be near my stepsister, and we lived at Bourne. I went to Cottenham School until 15. When I left school, I went to a knitting factory in Abbey Road in Cambridge, and then to Dolce's, the shoe shop in Petty Cury, and was there until I married. Uninvited Vegetables by Joan Slater. I was born in Leighton in the East End of London just before the war started and spent all the war years there. I was 3 when I started school and we had to have a rest in the afternoons. We would all lie on little rush mats in the hall. We didn't very often go to sleep though. If there was an air raid, all the children were marched to the cloakroom, which was reinforced for our safety. My father was in a reserved occupation at the time, so was not allowed to join the Navy as he had hoped. He worked in a glassblowers, making stoppers for medicine bottles. Although not in the forces, he did his bit by fire watching when he finished work. Several bombs fell in our area day and night. I can remember my mother wrapping me in a blanket when there was a night raid and taking me to the air shelter in the back garden. This happened most nights. The shelter always smelt musty, but we made the most of being safe. When we came out in the morning, we didn't know if we would still find the house standing. One night a bomb fell on the allotments about 100 yards away from our house, and we found vegetables in our garden which had been blown into the air with the force of the bomb and landed there. My mum made blackout curtains which we had to put up at the windows at night so that the Germans couldn't see any light. There was always a man who came round checking, and if he could see only a chink of light, he would knock at the door to warn us. All food and clothing was rationed, and each person had a ration book. The amount of meat we eat in one day now would have had to last about 2 weeks. I remember queuing outside the fishmonger's for what seemed like hours when word got round that he'd had a delivery. We did have an occasional fresh egg, as Mum's friend kept a few chickens, but most of the time we had dried egg, which could be mixed with water and then fried. It wasn't very nice, but better than nothing. 3 of my mum's sisters also lived in London and were all bombed out at some time or the other, and they and my cousins came to live with us until they were rehoused. Their husbands were all away fighting in the war. My grandmother lived in Columbia Road in Bethnal Green, where the big flower market is now. It was always there, but nowhere near as big as now. She would go hop picking every year to Hawkhurst in Kent. Mum and I would go with my aunts and cousins. We all stayed in a barn. We slept on straw-filled paillasses, which were not very comfortable. Us kids would do a bit of picking and then go off and play in the fields. It didn't seem to matter how many times you washed your hands. Everything tasted and smelt of hops. In the evenings we would go into the oast house, and it was lovely and warm, and we had a sing-song with all the other families. This doesn't happen now, of course, as hop picking is all mechanical. In the winter there always seemed to be loads of snow. There were about 10 kids of various ages in the road I lived in, and we all got together and made a huge snowball by rolling it up and down the road. There was a lamppost outside my house, and this used to be used as a wicket when we played cricket. I don't remember us breaking any windows, though. We played lots of street games: hopscotch, chase, football, knock down ginger. Only one person in the road had a car, so we never had to worry about traffic. No one had a telephone, so we had to go to the red phone box round the corner if we needed to make a phone call. It cost 2pence, that's 2 old pennies, which is less than 1 pence today. How different life is today from 70-odd years ago. Most people now have mobile phones, iPads, computers, cars, labour-saving gadgets of all kinds. We didn't have a washing machine or a tumble dryer. Mum had to wash everything with a glass scrubbing board and scrubbing brush, or boil it up in a copper gas boiler, which could boil over if not washed. We had a mangle. We used to wring out the water out of the washing and then hang on the washing line. We didn't have a fridge or freezer. The only cold place was a concrete shelf in the larder. We travelled everywhere by bus, train, or push bike.
Evacuees. Memories of My Childhood by Charles Dawson. I was born on the 23rd of July 1933 in Chelsham, Surrey, at my grandmother's house. But we lived in Harrow Road in Farley, the next village. My mother told me that when she was a young girl, Most of the family names in Chelsham were Peckett, my mother's, Peters, Penny and Sales. At each end of Harrow Road were public houses, the Bull and the Harrow, and the landlords were brothers by the name of Jack and Albert Sale. The public houses were built on the edge of commons, Bull Common and Farley Common. In the springtime we would play football on Farley Common and cricket in the summer months. In the autumn we would watch the local football club, Farley Rovers, on Saturdays, and on other days we would go nutting for hazelnuts and later in the year for chestnuts. We would go sledging from January to late February. We seemed to have a lot of snow when I was a lad, even over Christmas. We would have snowball fights and form a slide by treading down the snow on the footpath and slide on the snow with our leather-soled boots. The snow would start to melt, but it soon froze with the frost and would last for days. Just off Harrow Road was St Mary's Church Hall, a very large wooden hut where they would show Mickey Mouse films on Saturday afternoons in the 1930s and hold Sunday school on Sunday afternoons. I remember as a boy I would walk up to Dan Tucker's garage about a mile away with my trolley and take accumulators from our house and my auntie's to be recharged and bring the charged ones home. I got 2 pennies each for this, so before going back home I would call into Nellyfield's sweet shop and get some sweets. Before the war started, I remember seeing a red glow in the evening sky. It was the Crystal Palace burning down. Sometime later, when the war had started, I saw a similar red glow when Croydon Airport, about 5 miles away, was bombed by German aircraft. We lived halfway between Biggin Hill and Kenley, which were the main fighter airfields south of London. We saw many fights between German bombers and the British fighters. Once I witnessed a large German bomber surrendering to 2 Spitfires flying over near our house. The bomber was very low and had a white scarf hanging out of a window. It was forced down to land at Croydon Airport. During the Battle of Britain, we would sit in our air raid shelter for hours, both day and night, and with the aid of candles or oil lamps, we would read books to pass the time and to take our minds off the bombing and gunfire. For a change, we would do French knitting with a cotton reel and 4 nails around the hole in the cotton reel. My dad and uncle built our shelters out of steel sheets bolted together. During the time the air raid shelters were being built at school, with thick brickwork walls and a concrete roof, we did not have to go to school. So Mrs. Weller, a teacher who lived in the next road, would take 6 children at a time for lessons at her house each morning. We would take it in turns to go 1 day a week. After the Battle of Britain, the air raids were less frequent for a while. Days would go by without a raid, and we would sleep in our beds at night. During this period, the mothers of Harrow Road organised a picnic on one of the commons, starting off with games such as hide-and-seek and rounders, with the picnic afterwards. The days were sunny, and this made a nice day out, while many of our fathers were away on active service. There was a manor house in Chelsham called the Ledgers, where the Daniels family lived, and which sat in a very large area of land called a park. My mother told me that when she was a child, if they were out playing and a member of the Daniels family went by, the girls had to curtsy and the boys had to take off their hats. The Ledgers was a very large house, and at the start of the war only about 5 or 6 people lived there. So in the early 1940s, the family moved to a smaller house on the estate, and the military moved in. Soldiers camped in the grounds in tents, while the officers stayed in the house. The first regiment was the REME, Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, and they played football on the Farley Rovers ground near where I lived. Amongst these soldiers was an English international by the name of Britton, who played for Everton and England before and after the war. He would be the referee, as he was a class above the rest. At half-time, he would get us young lads on the pitch and teach us how to control the ball and other moves in football. The next group were Canadians, and a very large number of them too, who were also in tents. We all liked them, as they would give us sweets, which were rationed to us. We would visit them after school and at weekends. One afternoon I went to see them, and they had gone. It turned out to be just after D-Day. A few months before VE Day, 3 of the Canadian soldiers we knew came back to Farley to visit people. After their leave, they went back to war, and sadly, 2 of them were killed just before VE Day. Early 1944, there was a very big air raid aimed at London, which started in the morning and lasted all the rest of the day and through that night. We stayed in our shelter, and the noise seemed to be constant, with anti-aircraft guns firing and the noise coming in waves. We kept our hands over our ears and tried to sleep, and I suppose we did get some sleep. In the morning, when I looked out of the shelter, it was quiet and the sun was shining, and there was no damage to our house. It stayed quiet for about a week. Then the V1 rockets started. This was a different noise, more like a roar than a normal engine. And when the noise stopped, the V1s would come down, hit the ground, and explode. The V1s looked similar to planes with a large flame coming out of the back. They were nicknamed flying bombs or doodlebugs. There were 3 flight paths over our area. I think there were 7 in total, all aimed at London, and they could fly in all weathers, day or night. They were fast, and not many of our fighters could fly that fast, and shooting them down was dangerous, as they were flying bombs. Some of the pilots with the faster aircraft would fly alongside the V1s and tilt the wings over by tipping the wings of their aircraft's wings. This was also dangerous, as they might fall into a house below. The fighters would wait for them to fly over the channel and try to tip them into the sea. As a defence, barrage balloons were strung along the line of their flight paths. We had 2 balloons near us at each end of Harrow Road, one at Farley Common and one on Bull Common. They each caught a doodlebug, and the 2 pubs, the Harrow and the Bull, both suffered some damage. Landlords and their families survived, but unfortunately Mrs. Smith, who lived in the house next to the Bull, was not so lucky and was killed. It was about a month after the V1s started when the V2s arrived. These were much bigger, cigar-shaped rockets and could hit London in minutes. Because of their speed, air raid warning sirens were of no use, and so it was decided to evacuate all children over 5 years old and mothers with small children. The 5-year-olds and over went to Yeovil in Somerset, where they stayed with other families. The second group of evacuees, mothers with small children, together with older children, to keep families together, went to Paynton in Devon. Buses collected us and took us to the railway station at Whiteleaf in Surrey. We got on a train at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and there were already evacuees on the train. We stopped twice to pick up more, and then it was non-stop to Devon. Food and drinks were served to us on the train, and when we got to Paynton, we were taken to a school hall for a hot meal, and later to a hotel. The hotel was called Middle Park Hotel. It had no staff, but the beds were made, and the mothers were shown the kitchen before we went up to our room to leave our cases and unpack. Later, we were taken down to the dining room and given some more food and a hot drink, and then bed. The next morning, after breakfast, we were told to go shopping for food, so we could cook our own food in the kitchen and use the hotel's plates, cups, and cutlery. The mothers were responsible for cleaning their rooms, the corridors, staircases, all public rooms, and the kitchen. After food shopping, we went for a walk in the afternoon along the seafront. To our surprise, Tor Bay was full of American warships and sailors walking around Paynton in 2s and 3s. We children would say to the sailors, "Got any gum, chum?" And they would give us a packet of chewing gum. They were always very kind to us. All along the beach was a fence built of scaffolding, 10 to 12 feet high, and covered on both side and top with barbed wire to stop the German army coming ashore. The fence was about 5 to 6 feet wide and had been standing in the sea for about 4 years, so was very rusty. We continued our walk along the front up to the harbour. It was nice to see the sea again. My brother Peter had never seen the sea before, as he was only born in 1940. Days later, I went back to the beach with some friends. We soon found some big holes in the barbed wire so that we could get through and have a paddle when the tide was out. We spent days on the beach as it was summer. We did not go to school until September, so we had a long holiday at the seaside. Before we went to school, each child of school age was interviewed and was fitted into classes at various schools in the area. Some were going to school for the first time, and one boy who should have left school had to look for employment. He got a job at Paynton Zoo. The school I went to with some other boys from the hotel was in Totnes, about 5 miles away, and we went by bus. We were fishing one day near the harbour when a French evacuee caught a large conger eel. It weighed 14 pounds, and he had difficulty trying to land it. So a man who worked in the harbour helped him to get it ashore. The harbour master came out to congratulate him on catching such a large eel, and the local fish shop bought it. We heard on the radio that the bombing in London had stopped, and there were no more V1s or V2s, so my mother asked if we could go home. 2 weeks later, we, together with some other families, were given our railway tickets, and we were home for Christmas in 1945. Dad was in Italy in the 8th Army when we were evacuated to Devon. After the war ended and Dad was home, electricity came to Farley and Harrow Road, This was great. No more taking accumulators for the radio up to Dan Tucker's garage and bringing them back again. The new electric radios were a lot better in sound and broadcast more stations. And the electric lights in the house and the new electric street lights were much better than the gas lights that we had before.
We were evacuated by Pamela Cressy. We were an average middle-class family of 5, the Cordicks, Oscar and Rose, with Derek 17, Sheila 12, and me, Pamela, just 9. At 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September 1939, everything changed forever. It happened while we were on holiday in a little village in Snowdonia, and I remember how we sat round the old radio to hear the news. War was declared. There was at once an atmosphere of acute anxiety, and arrangements were made immediately. My father left before lunch in our Morris 10 for a secret destination. We were to stay at the cottage to go to school there, while Derek would go home to Cheam by train, where we would follow when our home was prepared with blackout screens for the downstairs windows and sticky tape protection. We would go to bed in the dark. Thus began a series of major permanent changes to all our lives. My father, a senior executive officer, billeting officer for the evacuation of the India Office from London to the Bromsgrove Public School, arranged accommodation in homes in the small town for a large staff. In the next 2 years, we saw him only occasionally. Back in Cheam, an air raid shelter was built under the rockery with corrugated iron and concrete. Soon my mother became ill and one day disappeared to hospital. That was the last time I ever saw her. Sheila and I were sent to a succession of friends locally and continued our schooling. At one, we were lovingly cared for, spending every night in their family shelter in the garden, while Mr. Atwater left as air raid warden, reporting each morning which local homes had been destroyed. He was our hero. My mother's friend was killed in a raid. Somehow we just accepted this strange situation. One weekend our father came home from Bromsgrove and stayed overnight in the shelter with us. It was a bad night. He was shocked and decided at once that we should be evacuated to Oxford, where our cousin had gone with her school, and we went to our first home she selected. We were very upset to be with strangers, referred to as evacuees to the couple's friends. I was angry that I was treated better than Sheila, I suppose, because being younger, I was less disturbed by all the upheaval and vulnerability of our situation. I remember always being frightened of doing something wrong. Good memories are of our cousin Frida taking us to a wood full of primroses. We were soon welcomed into Oxford High School, Sheila to Banbury Road and I to the lower school in Bardwell Road. We were both relieved when our second-year billet was much better, with Dr. and Mrs. Hunt in St. Margaret's Road. They were able to have us as their children had been sent to Canada for safety. They were very kind to us, interested in our story, and gave us such a good experience. We enjoyed helping out on their allotment and learnt how to eat globe artichokes. We did our best to cut the long grass for their elderly neighbour, to be rewarded with very stale, mouldy chocolate thrown to us from her upper window. We thanked her. We went visiting 2 elderly ladies across the road and were required to go to the local church with their strange maid, who weakly fainted, needing to be carried out of church. Our host's children came back from Canada, so we had to move on. We spent only 1 term with the maiden aunt of our gym mistress. Her house was very elegant, with a beautiful French chiming clock. Then, devastatingly, we were separated. But I was grateful that Sheila went to a very happy household, though I lived 3 miles away, with a newsagent sharing a room with his daughter, a girl in my class at school. It was at that time that we had a devastating shock when my father came with the news that Derek was missing, presumed killed, on a flying mission over the English Channel. I still shudder as I think of my lone cycle ride home along the deserted northern bypass in the dark. I was unable to tell my hosts why I could not stop crying. Every weekend, either Sheila or I braved the desolate bypass to meet up, cycling past an army camp from which wolf whistles frightened us. Soon after that, we decided that we had to run away, to cycle to our father 40 miles away. We set off on a cold, drizzly and windy morning. After about 12 miles, sheltering under a bridge, we faced the fact that we must turn back. No one had missed us. Our next family was with the Byrne family. Professor Byrne, seemingly strict. He gave us halibut oil every breakfast. His wonderful caring wife Kitty, George, Isabel, Francis, Frankie, the same age as me, who generously shared everything with me, and Bobby, a younger brother. I had many happy days there over the next year. One of the highlights was swimming secretly in the river very early in the morning and at night. Isabel, Frankie and I cycled all the way to Stratford and queued for the matinee to watch Shakespeare's Henry VIII. Sheila remained happily throughout the sixth form and then went back to Cheam. At that time, I went to the school boarding house with 40 other girls. In many ways, it was more relaxing without worrying all the time about doing something wrong in someone else's home. The housemistress was very positive, homely, a welcoming presence. She understood our varied needs and encouraged us through difficult times. We had lots of fun together, including listening to and being scared by the Triffids and Dick Barton. Each evening, we had a half-hour supervised drawing room with our friends when we played games or heard a story. I joined the bee club with a hive in our large garden and learned how to keep bees with the housemistress. We produced good honey for the boarding house to enjoy. Money became an issue, so I left school after 1 year in the sixth form, aged 16, and started work. That was all about school time. The holidays were very different and exciting. Our father was living on a large mixed farm, and that was where we stayed. We enjoyed helping with the chickens and the cows and learned to put lids on milk bottles in the very cold dairy. Sometimes we made mistakes, as when we mixed up the eggs we collected from the hen houses with others from the hedgerows, some of which were old and addled. We were shouted at. We joined women from London in pea picking and lifting potatoes. We learned some new swear words. We rode in the horse-drawn cart, distributing sugar beet to the cattle and hay to the sheep. We went to bed by candlelight and in winter washed in frozen water. Large wood fires kept us warm downstairs, but made our chilblains very painful. At Bromsgrove Boys' Public School, a beautiful campus established in the 16th century, there were parts where we could be entertained, including an outdoor swimming pool, where I learned to swim. We were taught ballroom dancing in the large hall. We mastered the quick-step, waltz and foxtrot, the volita, Lambeth walk, palais glide, and our favourite, the conga. On later holidays, we stayed with a very deaf elderly woman who was kind and fed us well. Once a week, we went to the public bath, which was luxurious, with a huge, deep, hot bath, brass taps and a large hot towel prepared by the kindly attendant. We were kept occupied reshelving books as volunteers in the local children's public library and welcomed in customers. We befriended the mice that lived in the storeroom. At the weekends, we cycled as a family in the countryside for picnics. It must have been difficult for my father to keep us safe, happy and occupied while he was at work. Back in 1944, the India office was back in London, so our holidays back in Cheam included staying safe from the V1 doodlebugs, which were a common sight and sound by day and night, with their flares and chugging engines, and the more sinister silent V2s. So it was back to the air raid shelters. Favourite radio programmes were Itmar, It's That Man Again, and Round the Horn. Family holidays were spent river camping on the Thames in special punts fitted with hooped awnings, a primer stove and blankets. Close friends joined us, one of whom was our expert in punting. He taught us the professional way to manoeuvre our 2 punts. It has been a useful skill to enjoy and pass on in Cambridge. The weather was sometimes a challenge. It was on the riverbank that we received news of VJ Day on the 15th of July 1945. The war was over, and everything changed yet again. My Brother Nearly Shot Me by Muriel Bradley. The day my brother nearly shot me with a hunting rifle was memorable. Peter and I had been sent to live with an uncle in Canada for the duration of World War II. We had just arrived, and to us, an 11-year-old girl and a 14-year-old boy from North London, we were stepping into a fascinating new world. Our arrival time was unexpected, so our uncle and aunt were out. They left the house open with a note. "Welcome, make yourselves at home," and we, being endowed with insatiable curiosity, explored. The house was so different from our London one with its predictable layout. The elegant veranda and rocking chairs, the basement housing a Bendix washing machine, it washes, rinses and spins, an ironing machine, apple barrels, a pickle and jam store, and of course a huge furnace and coal store, made it a place of wonder. Further exploration upstairs revealed our separate bedrooms, marked Peter and Muriel. We had arrived and felt at home. In my room, I immediately became mesmerized by a bookcase full of books. But Peter, a devotee of Gene Autry, Destry, who had recently ridden again, and other gunslinging cowboys, spotted a rifle hanging at the end of his clothes closet. My instincts were to leave it alone. Peter's were quite the opposite, and in a flash he had grabbed it and was aiming out of the window. "Peter!" I shrieked. "Put it down!" He swung round, the rifle pointing at me. "Ninny, it's all right, fraidy cat." "How do you know?" I moved out of line. "Because nobody leaves a loaded rifle in a cupboard," he grinned smugly. "Look." He pointed the rifle at the floor and squeezed the trigger. There was a thud, and I saw the hard wood of the floor splinter as a bullet embedded itself completely. It was not surprising, upon reflection, that my uncle and aunt didn't make a great fuss when they arrived home to find us pale and shaken. Our welcome to our new life in Canada was not all that had been planned. Dinner was delicious, but eaten in silence as we all pondered on what it could have been. There were no recriminations, no lessons learned, although they had just been a huge relief, and a tacit understanding that no more should be said, and nothing was said. The shattered floor was mended, and a rug placed over the repair. My uncle removed his guns to a locked cupboard. Evacuation Memories by Mary Parker. I was born on the 14th of August in 1929 at 8C Grand Parade, Haringey. My mother died at birth. I lived with my father and maternal grandmother at that address for 2 or 3 years until my grandmother died, and I was sent to live with a Mrs. Edith Kerr and her husband in Tottenham, where I went to school in Ellesmead Road in 1935. Mrs. Kerr worked for my grandmother, so I was quite used to having her around. We had come home from holidaying in Weymouth, and a letter was waiting, asking for me to be ready for my new home. My stepmother was lovely, and I loved her. She'd been married before, but had no children. I was allowed all the neighbourhood children in to play. Next door to us lived her niece, Joan, nicknamed Jojo. We became almost like sisters, being the same age. All the clothes we wore identical. One or other parent made them. We had a very nice life and went to Stamford Hill School until 1939, when war was declared. Up until then, we'd had long summer holidays at Jojo's grandmother's on the coast at Dovercourt. There were lots of children in that family, and we were allowed to roam the beaches as long as we stayed together. Very often we were away all day. Several days before the war was declared, Jo and I, and with the rest of the school, were evacuated. We had been going to the school at the crack of dawn for a week before this with our large green haversacks on our backs and our gas masks slung around our necks. Everyone had a gas mask, even babies, and we had to take them everywhere with us. We were marched up to Manor House Underground Station en route for King's Cross Railway Station. It must have been terrible. All those children going out of London on one day. Mothers were crying and nobody knew where they were going. It's all rather funny, really. It seemed to blow over us. We thought, or had been told, it was a holiday. And we were lucky. Having been away from home quite often, we were not too bothered. Some of the children were heartbroken, having never been anywhere outside their own street, never having seen a field or a cow. The organising of all this must have been fantastic. It's never been done before or since. We arrived at Peterborough Station and were taken in coaches to a school where we were given a carrier bag filled with chocolate, tins of fruit, etc., so we weren't going to starve. Then off again in coaches, being dropped at villages along the way. Jo and I were told we must stay together, and as we weren't nice girls, we were picked by Mrs. Waterworth to go and live with her at Old Walton Manor. Lovely and very lucky. It was a continuation of a lovely childhood. We also had the added supervision of the maid, who was herself all of 16 at the time. We learned to play tennis on the tennis court in the garden, great fun, and we were given an old hut at the bottom of the garden where we kept rabbits, which we bred and sold at the market, quite lucrative. Nobody ever stopped us or told us we couldn't do it. In summer, we spent most of our time swimming in the river or roaming around the countryside. Eventually, there were only a handful of evacuees left, and we were integrated into the village school, where I met my future husband, sister-in-law and brothers-in-law, none of us knowing at that time what the future held. We were taught first aid and how to deal with incendiary bombs with a stirrup pump and in our gas masks. We were allocated certain houses, from each of which we collected all the newspapers every week in a wheelbarrow, helping the war effort, they called it. I remember knitting a balaclava helmet at school for a soldier. I always felt so sorry for the poor soldier who had to wear it. We were all very industrious, doing our bit, knitting, crocheting and sewing. It was fun. In winter, we went skating on the ponds. We had sledges made for us with barrel iron over the runners, which we candle greased to make them go faster. The field was always lit up at night with the searchlights from the army battery up the road. It used to snow and freeze like mad in those days. Everywhere in the village was very dark. Nobody was allowed to show any light, not even a chink. The air raid precaution men used to come round, and one got into trouble if there was a glimmer anywhere. On a Sunday morning, we would go and sit on the fence and watch the Home Guard drilling. That was even funnier than Dad's army shown on TV later years. We stayed at the manor until 1943, when we came home to London, and soon afterwards the doodlebugs or flying bombs started to fly over the city. We went back to Stamford Hill School for Girls for a while, and then in 1944 we were sent to Pitman's College for a 2-year apprenticeship. Not that this did much good. We spent a considerable time up and down to the cellars, as the doodlebugs were becoming quite frequent. Jo managed to fall downstairs in one mad rush and covered herself in red ink. I remember she had on a new grey coat at the time, and we spent the rest of the day trying to get the coat clean. One could not buy coats easily. Everything was on coupons. After college, I did nothing for a while. I really wanted to go into the Land Army, but my father would have none of it. Instead, I eventually went into a factory testing thermometers. My father hit the roof. I stayed for a while, then moved on to make radar equipment at another firm. That was the end of my working days in London. Leisure time through my teens was something I wouldn't have missed for the world. Everything in the entertainment world was starting up again, 1945 to 46. As I lived near Haringey Arena and Alexandra Palace, we didn't have to travel far. There were lots of exhibitions held in the bomb craters along Tottenham Court Road, roller skating at Alexandra Palace, ice skating at Haringey, speedway, circuses, concerts, theatre, and of course the cinema. We really had a good time on very little money. We could still get on a tram and go for a ride along the embankment from Manor House. There were no petrol buses, they were all trolley buses. When Mary wrote this memoir many years ago, she was writing it for her children. You need to know that in order to understand the final paragraph. In 1949, I went to your father's 21st birthday party, and from then on, that's the end of this story.
We Went to Morecambe by Howard Slater. I started school when I was 3 in Leighton, in the East End of London. I was 4 when the war started in 1939, still living in Leighton. East London was where the Blitz was centred. During the Battle of Britain in 1940-41, I can remember standing in the street watching the British and German planes, mainly bombers and fighters, having dogfights over London. Blackout curtains had to be put up over the windows at night so the German planes couldn't see any houses lit up. There were no street lights either, and very little traffic, as only the emergency services were allowed to have petrol. All food was rationed, which meant each person had to have a ration book to buy food or clothes. Each person was allowed about 2 ounces of butter and about 4 ounces of meat a week. We very rarely had fish or fruit. We used to play on the bombed sites and collect shrapnel to swap with other kids at school. It was a sense of adventure. I was never frightened. When I was older, my mother used to send me to the gasworks to get coal. On the way, I would drop off the bagwash at laundry. I made an old wheelbarrow which I took with me to carry it in. It was about a 6-mile round trip. One day she asked me to go, but I wouldn't. It was just as well, as a bomb fell on the yard about the time I would have been there. If I had, I might not be here now. Lots of bombs fell around the area where we lived, and if there was a raid locally, we used to spend the duration of the raid in the Anderson shelter dug into our garden. It was not very pleasant. It was damp and cold. A bomb fell on the bus garage not far from our house and shattered all our windows. The road we lived in was quite short, with only 40 houses, but each end suffered bomb damage. In 1944, my brother, sister and I were evacuated to Morecambe in the north of England with a trainload of other children after the V-1 rockets started falling on London and before the V-2s started. I was 8 or 9 at the time. We went away without our parents. I remember our father taking us to one of the local schools where we were lined up in the playground with our gas masks and labels with our names on. Several London double-decker buses were queued up at the gate. These took us to Euston Station in London. On the way, I remember seeing a fishing tackle shop under the arches of Hackney Downs railway station. We were accompanied on the journey by WVS ladies. We went to Euston Station in Morecambe, which doesn't exist now. We were met by a very nice man who was the billeting officer. We were taken to the village of Torrisholme on the outskirts of Morecambe, and there we were paraded for local residents to pick out who they wanted to take on. My sister went with one family and my younger brother to another. The family who took my brother were asked if they would take me too, which they did. The family were very nice and looked after us very well. We went to school in Pedder Street, Morecambe. This was an old church building, which is now a Sea Scout hall. The boys' class was downstairs and the girls' was upstairs. Boys and girls had to enter from different sides of the building. On the way to school on the bus, we would rocket from side to side singing "Roll Me Over in the Clover." One day, my brother and I decided not to go to school, but to go down to the beach. Unluckily for us, our teacher decided to bring the class to the beach for a lesson. We hid in the clock tower so that we couldn't be seen. Obviously, living near the sea, the beach and the prom were our daily playground.
Island by Ruth Haynes. It began with a rough crossing. In January 1936, the day after George V died, we were on the Irish Sea en route to the Isle of Man. My father was about to start in a veterinary practice there, replacing the local vet who was retiring. My mother, who had hardly ever left Cheshire, felt she was going to Ultima Thule. I was not yet 2, but got the impression that the Irish Sea could make you feel unwell, an impression that did not fade with time. The Isle of Man was then a popular holiday resort for the industrial north and Scotland, and thousands of people came to spend their wakes weeks there. Horse trams were one of the local attractions which ran along the 2 miles of Douglas Promenade. As local vet, my father used to visit the stables daily to inspect the 80 horses, and I often went with him. Mostly Irish Draught and Clydesdale, the horses all had names. Even in the winter when they worked on farms and later in World War II when they did other draft work in town, individual horses could still be recognised. Of his general work, the images we see on TV's Yorkshire Vet were those that he saw daily, but without the benefit of modern drugs or technical assistance. Like James Herriot, he had qualified in Scotland in the 1920s and shared many of his experiences. He had a small surgery beside a smithy where he mixed his own medicines, while I watched the blacksmith shoeing the horses. The coming of penicillin and other antibiotics made a tremendous difference to his work. My earliest memories of the island were of the sea, lots of picnics on wide sandy beaches and rocky coves, with rock pools to explore. From the age of 7 or 8, I often stayed on farms, learning how to milk and how to feed the lambs and calves. It was not always sunny. The Manx climate was wet and windy, and sometimes snowy. In winter, I remember the dismal sound of the foghorn when fog covered the island, a sinister sound at night. My parents loved wild flowers, so we often explored the glens filled with primroses, bluebells and ferns and wild garlic. Heather and gorse covered the hills, and there were harebells on the hedges. Thrift and sea campions were found on the rocky headlands, along with many other flowers. Seagulls always screeched overhead, but on Spanish Head, choughs flew over the high cliffs, and there were scores of seabirds. A favourite place was the Sound, overlooking the Calf of Man, with its tidal race and whirlpools. When I was older, I used to accompany my father in a small boat over to the Calf to TB test the cattle there, and it was always an interesting ride. World War II brought many changes. The island became an important internment camp, and all the hotels and boarding houses along the seaside promenade were enclosed in double barbed wire barricades. Most internees were alien civilians living in Britain when war broke out, and included many Jews who had just escaped Europe, intellectuals and writers, and musicians like the Amadeus Quartet, 3 of whom met in the camps. Later, when women were interned, my mother and friends would take them cakes and jam in return for beautifully knitted garments which they made. I do not think they were seen as the enemy. For me, the most dramatic change in 1939 was starting school. It was a small school of 80 pupils, mostly local. After September, there were a number of other children whose fathers were serving in the army or navy, and others escaping the bombing in England. A special friend was Inga, whose Austrian family had all been taken, though I'm not sure if at that stage she knew the final end of the story. Another Austrian teacher, who taught languages in several schools, had probably been released from internment, and he remained on the island. For us, the visible changes were the sudden loss of the lights along the promenade on September the 1st, the disappearance of the trams and the horses, blackouts, and of course gas masks. In fact, we had almost no bombing, but could often hear the German planes returning from bombing Belfast. The sirens went, and we were probably only sheltered under the stairs. Father had to drive with cowls on his headlights throughout the war, and frequently had to change his poor quality wartime tyres. At that time, the only vet, he often had to work at night, and the lack of mobile phones meant much time could be wasted. Much of the work was with cattle in calving emergencies or serious accidents. Rationing was probably less stringent than in England. Fish was readily available, and one could get rabbits and wood pigeon. We were all keen foragers and picked mushrooms, crab apples, bilberries, and blackberries in season. We grew a lot in the garden and had a market garden opposite, so could usually get fruit and vegetables. Parents who had experienced World War I knew a lot about make, do and mend, so nothing was wasted. Clothes were repaired, handed on, or unravelled and reknitted. All the baking was done at home, and things like sugar saved up for making jam or bottling fruit. My mother had grown up on a Cheshire farm, so was very resourceful. Her shock horror on meeting a bought cake when out resembled Lady Bracknell's handbag. The joy of living on an island was the freedom to explore, to become familiar with all its features. As teenagers, we walked and cycled over the whole island and got around on the small steam trains and the Manx Electric Railway, which ran up the coast from Douglas to Ramsey and up Snae Fell, the highest mountain. In 1956, I married Patrick and spent the next 20 years living on other islands, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago and Fiji, which I explored equally thoroughly. Usually, I had the sight or sound of the sea in the background. Somehow the constant noise of the A14 sounds nothing like the sea, and I find Girton much too far inland. Wartime in the Country by Helen Wickham. During the war, we were evacuated to my grandmother's in Ilkley. Due to childhood polio, my father was unfit for any kind of military service. He remarked ruefully that the only discomfort he suffered was fire-watching with a man who snored. Schools. My small private school evacuated from Leeds to Nunnington Hall in Yorkshire, now owned by the National Trust. I have many happy memories playing shop with beech nuts under two magnificent copper beeches, eating honeycomb from the resident bees, picking rosehips for rosehip syrup, and the teacher gathering nettles for nettle soup. On Sunday afternoons, we were invited to the owner's drawing room for tea, and she taught us how to play Old Maid. The splendid tapestries on the walls are, I think, still there. When we were invited to celebrate the christening of a young family member, my mother said I was very impressed by the bishop's hat. Later, I was evacuated with another school to the Lake District. Again, happy memories. Rabbits on the lawn in the early morning, a walnut tree at the edge of the woods, swimming in Bassenthwaite Lake, which was very cold, playing sheep, as I had a deep voice even then and was rather dull. I was the mother sheep, while the young lambs scampered about in the woods. Ilkley. There, with some friends, we made a semi-underground den on the moors and skated on the tarn. We made a snow house in the garden. I read my father's old-fashioned school stories and tried to turn them into little plays. I watched my uncle training cadets in the schoolyard behind our house. We attended the local congregational church, and I went to Sunday school as well, as I was fond of the teacher who used to take us for walks. Rations. Our family butter ration was sent in a huge lump. My job was to divide it into portions for each family member, which were placed on little plates with our names on a flag. As we were a large family, my mother would swap some of our tea coupons for clothing coupons with a friend who only had one child, probably illegal. Childhood illnesses. Measles. We all got measles at school. Those who were really ill were kept in a darkened room to protect their sight. Mumps. My sister and I had a jigsaw of Churchill and thought he must have mumps too. German measles rubella was not thought to be serious. I hope I didn't infect any pregnant women when I went shopping in town with my mother. Whooping cough. A terrible thing. I was off school 3 months, coughing, whooping, being sick. Aged 10, I mostly had to look after myself, as my mother was self-isolating with a new baby. How did my grandmother manage? Who cooked the meals? Not the maternity nurse who looked after my mother. Now we have vaccinations for these horrors. Let us give thanks that we have vaccinations for COVID-19 too. Food. Memories by Anne Anonymous. I lived in a small town south of Bristol from the beginning of the war in September 1939, and I remember my parents telling me on the day war was declared. They were so anxious. Rationing of coal, food, clothes and petrol soon began. My father dug up part of the lawn to plant potatoes, carrots, parsnips, etc., and also gooseberry, blackcurrant and raspberry plants. Because my father was a doctor, we were able to go with him when his work took him to neighbouring towns. Sometimes he was given eggs, which my mother put in a bucket filled with a sticky liquid called water glass. Carrots, etc., were kept in sand. Cooked fruit went into sealed Kilner jars, as there was not enough sugar to make jam. Very welcome food parcels came occasionally from my mother's relations in Canada. Windows had blackout curtains, no TV, no freezers. When I was at boarding school, we occasionally heard air raid sirens and had to go into the basement. The butter ration came with our name on a saucer. Food was very boring, and no bananas or oranges. Often, instead of games, we worked in the fields and picked rose hips, which were made into a syrup. Learning French and German was more difficult, as there were, of course, no foreign trips and holidays abroad. My first job was in 1943 at a secret weapons centre. In 1944, I joined the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and went on a troop ship to Algiers. Later that year, I went to Bari in southern Italy, then Rome, Siena, and to Florence. When peace was declared, I was in Florence. Liverpool Docks, 1944. Huge ship looming, many gangplanks emerging like ants, soldiers entering. Young girls, kit bags shouldering, khaki-clad soldiers whistling. Young girls walking hesitatingly, at last up gangplanks, climbing to destinations unknown going.
Ministry of Food by Bernard Townsend. I remember the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 quite clearly, although I was only 5 years old at the time. I was playing with friends in the road outside our home, as one did in those days, because it was safe as there was so little traffic. My mother came to the gate in a fluster and called my brother and me in. She had heard an announcement on the radio that war had been declared, and I think it frightened the life out of her, or at least she appeared quite upset. I think she feared the invasion was imminent. Home was in Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire. If I close my eyes, I can still see every detail of the house and particularly the garden, because I used to climb the tall fence and escape to play with friends. We had a dog called Jack, an Airedale, but he couldn't come with me because he was far too big. There were only 2 streets in this new village, so we were in the country with farmland all around us. The nearest railway station was Rye House on the LNER line to Liverpool Street, and a mile from the house. And the nearest pub was the Boar's Head, but that was only 3/4 of a mile distant. My father was born in Edmonton, and in preparation for his marriage, he bought the property in Hoddesdon in Hertfordshire, which was on the outskirts of the village. It was part of a new development aimed at attracting people from nearby towns like Hertford and Waltham Cross. He once told me how much he paid for the house. In those days it was considered a fortune. Today I don't think it would have been enough for a deposit. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention the figure. It was easy to remember because it was £364. My dad was a Unilever man all his working life. His company awarded him a gold-engraved watch in recognition for his outstanding service. But at the outbreak of war, he was not called up, but seconded by Unilever to a new Department of State being set up called the Ministry of Food. Specialists were recruited widely from industry and commerce to serve in this new organisation. This new department, nicknamed the M of F, was housed in temporary buildings in Stanmore in Middlesex. The year was 1939. But why did they want my dad? His specialism was oils and fats, a commodity group vital for use in the food industry. In the early days of the war, there was a need to find alternative sources of supply and substitute products, and this was an activity my dad became involved in. Initially, this new ministry was set up in Stanmore. Someone must have told Herr Hitler what was going on, and it wasn't long before German bombers were dispatched to destroy the fledgling new department. So a new, safer house was found, and the ministry was moved to Wales. It was little known just how important the work undertaken in Colwyn Bay would be to the survival of our population. But from this base on the North Wales coast, the team of experts set about the enormous task of organising the distribution and rationing of food. They also initiated the massive propaganda effort to convince the population to dig for victory. It was from Colwyn Bay that the initiative to inform us, to educate us, to convince us that we had to find ways of feeding ourselves was launched. I'm sure some readers will remember this huge campaign to sacrifice our lovely gardens, flower beds, bushes and borders, and plant potatoes, cabbages, carrots, and other vegetables and fruit. I remember the hive of activity it created, but it worked. It was a great success, and its impact can still be seen today. 80 years on, we, like many families, are still growing our own vegetables and know they are better flavoured and fresher than any supermarket product around. We should never forget the huge success of this small team of civil servants and seconded staff working away from their loved ones. Without their efforts, the people of Britain could have been starved into submission by Hitler's U-boats, surface ships and aircraft doing their best to blockade Britain. Why was Colwyn Bay selected as the new location for the Ministry of Food? It was a wonderful spot on the sunny coast in North Wales, a long way from our huge industrial cities. By 1939, it was a very popular holiday resort. It had many good hotels and a wide range of bed and breakfast establishments, ripe for immediate occupation by large numbers of people. And if you wanted secrecy, and to be away from prying eyes, what better location than Colwyn Bay? My father moved there in 1940, and one of his urgent tasks was to find accommodation for his family. He found a property owned by an elderly lady living on her own in a large house, but also containing the equivalent of a 3-bedroomed flat. Sadly, there was only one entrance. The garden was overgrown. It was at the end of a cul-de-sac, so it was quiet, with no traffic to worry my parents. But it meant we lost our independence. It was in the middle of the town, so it was easy to get to the shops. As the choice of accommodation available was limited and the demand high, my father took it. We moved in 1940 and stayed until the end of the war. Life in Wales then was very different from Hertfordshire, and Sundays particularly so. We didn't have a car, but we children acquired cycles. Our parents didn't cycle, so as a family we walked everywhere, but the bus service was good. The sea was 12 minutes from the house, and the main attraction, in that it offered a huge, sandy, safe playing ground. None of us could swim, but we loved beach life, fishing, catching crabs, splashing in pools, and making sandcastles. But the biggest joy was skimming flat stones on the surface of the water. In today's speak, we would say we were doing a Barnes Wallis. The railway ran along the coast and was the main line link from Crewe to Llandudno. In those days, engines were coal-fired and steam-driven, and to us kids they were monsters with which we quickly fell in love. My brother started collecting engine numbers and studying the whole railway system. We found that our network was part of LMS, and there were 3 other main ones called LNER, GWR, and SR. The next move was to find out what publications existed to fill in the background and technical data we needed. And who entered our lives but Ian Allen?
School. 3 Schools by Angela Blackburn. I started school at Blowers Green Primary School in Dudley in 1949. It was a very modern school with one wall almost all glass, buildings arranged in a horseshoe around the playground. I'd been dying to go to school after my best friend and playmate Timothy started at a different school. Imagine my shock, however, when on the first day my mother took me there and just left me. There were no gradual introductions to a new routine in those days, but I was happy in that progressive environment. When from time to time my mother asked me what I had done at school that day, I replied, "Just play." Then one day I brought a book home and read it from cover to cover. Thanks to the Beacon readers, "Do as I do," said the little red hen. Does anyone remember that? The family moved to Edinburgh in the winter of 1950, as our house wasn't ready, and my mother and we 4 children stayed for a while with relations in Argyllshire, in the Northwest Highlands. My mother enrolled me and my older brother in the village school, Drewrose Primary School, for a term. There was a single classroom in the small Victorian building, dating from 1877, for the local enrolment of about 20 pupils, with one lady teacher in charge. We sat in rows from front to back, starting at the bottom left from the teacher's perspective and snaking round to top right, arranged according to the multiplication tables we had mastered. Although I could read, I had not learned any multiplication tables, so I was placed at the very bottom left, where I was supposed to apply myself to learning the 2 times table. My older brother, who was much cleverer than me, was at far some distant desk out of sight behind me. It must have been very like that in the original Girton Endowed School. The school opened directly onto the road, but there was very little traffic on that remote rural road in those days, so there was little danger. We walked to school, as probably did most of the children, without an adult to accompany us, as everybody who knew everybody was in that tiny community. After that brief interlude, we moved to Edinburgh, and I and my brother started at my 3rd school, Forsterfine School on the city fringes. The school was in a tall, gaunt, stone Victorian building with windows placed high in the walls so the children couldn't see out and be distracted. The teacher's desk at the front was on a raised dais with a blackboard behind. The desks were iron-framed with seats and desktops that lifted up and fell back down with a crash. Under the sloping desktop there was just a shelf, and in the top there was a hole for an inkwell and a groove to hold your pen or pencil to stop it rolling down the slope. We generally didn't have paper and pencils, but wrote on slates with a slate pencil, which was another turned piece of slate. You cleaned off the slate with a piece of damp sponge or rag, which became rapidly smellier as the term progressed. When we began to learn joined-up writing, we were issued with paper, one sheet at a time, to make fair copies using ink and a steel-tipped dipping pen. Then the inkwells were loaded with a rather foul black liquid which we suspected was made out of soot, and which seemed to have the property of corroding our pen nibs so they spluttered, spoiling the fairness of our copies and earning our teachers' displeasure. But to be appointed ink monitor and go round filling the inkwells was regarded as a high honour. The girls all sat on one side of the room and the boys all sat on the other. Outside there was a girls' playground on one side of the school building and a boys' playground on the other, with a small walled area in between for the infants. At the bottom of each playground were the lavatories in a separate building. Of course, it was all tarmacked. We played all sorts of games, skipping with ropes, including a game where two girls each took one end of a long rope and the others had to jump through in a line without breaking the rhythm. Various variations on the games of tag and hopscotch, spinning a wooden whipping top, which entailed wrapping the thong of a small whip around the top and letting it fly on the ground and whipping it to keep it going. We would colour the top with chalks and watch the separate colours turn to rainbows. In the winter, when the ground was frosty, we would make impromptu ice slides on the sloping ground. The education was aimed at creating useful, literate members of society who would know their role and station in life. We were soundly drilled in our multiplication tables, which we chanted out in unison, and mental arithmetic was practised every day. We learned to add up long columns of figures with great rapidity, useful if we were to become clerks. It would be a long time before the pocket calculator made such skills redundant. We were given long spelling lists to learn by heart. We were taught Scottish history, of course. We were in Scotland. And I remember when our present Queen's coronation came around, most of the banners that decorated the city celebrated Elizabeth I, as she was the first Elizabeth to be Queen of Scotland. I only remember one art lesson. It was given by a student teacher and was obviously highly experimental. With no science or poetry or foreign languages, music was singing old folk songs to a piano accompaniment. The Golden Vanity, Early One Morning, oddly all English folk songs. Perhaps Robbie Burns was too adult for us. I only remember one art lesson. It was given by a student teacher and was obviously highly experimental. No science or poetry or foreign languages. Music was singing old folk songs to a piano accompaniment. The Golden Vanity, Early One Morning, and oddly all English folk songs. Perhaps Robert Burns was too adult for us. My most hated lesson was needlework. The boys all got to do gardening, but the girls had to do needlework. My first excruciating term of needlework was spent knitting something called a kettle holder in blue wool, basically a 6-inch square. I had no idea what a kettle holder was, living in a house where the children were on no account allowed to touch the handles of hot pots. Oh, the misery of struggling with one knit pole one in pursuit of an incomprehensible goal, while thinking about the boys in the lovely fresh air, digging and planting and growing things. We had no school uniform, but all the boys wore shorts and all the girls wore skirts and dresses. There was one American boy in my class for a time. There were still Americans stationed at air bases nearby, and he wore long trousers, jeans, which struck us as very exotic. He used to bring an American comics to school to trade. Wonderful creations they were, in full colour on glossy paper, with the adventures, which were new to us, of Batman and Superman, and which my family dismissed as rubbish. Our British comics were the Beano, twopence, the Dandy, twopence, the Eagle, fourpence, and Girl, fourpence. Eagle's sister paper, but not a patch on the boys' version. The other things we spent our pocket money on were sweets from the shop round the corner from the school. Every school had a sweet shop around the corner, most injurious to the nation's teeth, just as the chip shop around the corner has been injurious to its waistlines in recent years. A penny gobstopper, each sugary layer a different colour, could last for days if carefully wrapped in a hanky or piece of paper in between sucks. Licorice bootlaces were popular, and sherbet straws, a tube of sherbet powder with a licorice straw to suck it up. I have two bad memories of Corstorphine School. One, unsurprisingly, was school dinner, which was prepared in a central kitchen in Edinburgh and sent round on lorries in big urns like milk churns. The menu was the same each week: Monday, mince; Tuesday, soup, a lump of cheese and a roll; Wednesday, stew and dumplings, and so on. The meat was always tough, the soup tasted disgusting, and it all looked like a grey-brown sludge, but woe betide you if you didn't finish it all up. The other bad memory was the use of the strap, otherwise known as the tawse, a leather strap with one end split into three, which was used to punish children on quite a regular basis. The class teacher would strike children on the hand, and it stung for minor misdemeanours. For major misdemeanours, girls were sent to the headmistress for more severe punishment, and the boys were sent to the headmaster. The headmaster, we thought at the time, and I think so still, was a brute. He would beat boys regularly hard on their backside until they howled. It's amazing to think that corporal punishment was not banned in Scottish state schools until 1987, and in Scottish private schools in 1998. I looked for my first school, Blowers Green, on the internet and found it had recently been rated outstanding by Ofsted. Druro Primary School had 2 teachers from 1980, but still only had 1 room until 1986, when an extension added a second room and indoor toilets. Corstorphine School was rated by Ofsted as good across most measures. The outside toilets are no more. Words like kindness appear in the school brochure, and school meals are prepared on the premises. It wasn't all wonderful in the golden days. Some things do get better.
Memories of Park Street Church of England Aided School, Cambridge, 1943 to 1949, by Roger Wolfe. Conflicting cultures. "Whatcha, Roger?" called my school friend Ron. "Whatcha, Ron?" I called back. The exchange would have passed unnoticed had my mother not overheard. She disapproved. The commonplace expressions of boys in Back Street, Cambridge, were not acceptable at home. I had been caught out. My schooling had previously started at a small private establishment close to where I lived in Thornton Road, Girton. That school was not a successful enterprise and closed not long after I had made an unhappy start. So together with my older brother and several other Girton children, I was enrolled at Park Street School when I was about 6 years old. Life at the new school was very different. Many of my classmates came from homes less spacious and well-appointed than my own, and several were officially deemed to be undernourished and were given a daily supplement of malt and cod liver oil. As one of the teachers was heard to comment, "These Girton children are so well washed and fed." Once I had to accompany a sickly infant to her home during the school day. She led the way to a cramped courtyard off King Street. Her mother thanked me for bringing her child safely home, but sensing my unease at entering such claustrophobic living conditions, she felt obliged to apologize. It was an uncomfortable moment. School run. To get to and from school, we used Eastern Counties Service 106. The buses ran every 12 minutes, and the child fare was 1p each way. At the end of the school day, my older brother had the responsibility of seeing me safely across Bridge Street to wait at the bus stop opposite Portugal Place. The bus often arrived already filled with shoppers, and we were unable to get on. Rather than wait for the next bus, which would almost certainly be equally full, we often chased over Magdalen Bridge, hoping that the bus would be delayed by traffic lights and delivery vans in the narrow street. Still unable to get aboard at the stop opposite St. Giles Church, we raced off again, legs aching and windpipes bursting, as the bus laboured up Castle Street, the hill, to the Shire Hall stop. Here a few passengers might get off, but usually we had to continue the chase to Histon Road Corner. Here many passengers got off, and we could stagger aboard, utterly exhausted. Lights. "Please, miss, can we have the lights on?" We were not afraid to ask our lower junior teacher, Miss Chesterton, because she was nice. She looked up at the gas mantles suspended from the lofty ceiling of the classroom, but was clearly at a loss to know what to do. Apologetically, she tapped on the door of the adjacent classroom to catch the attention of the older, more experienced teacher of top class. After a hushed, urgent conversation, it was decided to ask the head teacher, Miss Ditton. Miss Ditton looked doubtful, reluctant to approve such a disruptive event as having the lights on. "Is it really necessary?" she asked, glancing imperiously at her handwriting exercise. Awed into silence by her presence, but sensing that a decision was in the balance, we did our best to mime short-sightedness, and Jimmy, always the most forthcoming member of the class, ventured a stage whisper, "Can't see what I'm writing." After more entreaties from the teachers, Miss Ditton reluctantly gave in, and to our intense but suppressed excitement, ordered all teachers to be ready for the lights to be turned on. Plunging the tip of a tightly rolled newspaper into the flames of the open fires that heated, or failed to heat, each of the classrooms, she paraded grandly through the school, bearing the improvised torch aloft. As she entered each classroom, the teacher in charge reached up to tug the chain dangling below the gas mantles. A faint pop sounded as the gas lit, followed by a soft, mellow glow. How wonderful we thought it was, and how sad we were when the clouds rolled back, sunlight returned, and the gas mantles were turned off one by one. As soon as we arrived home, we excitedly told our parents we had the lights on at school. Summer storm. Once, at the time of the Midsummer Fair, our rooms were darkened by a spectacular storm. Searing flashes of lightning were followed instantly by crashes of thunder that shook the building. Torrents of rain beat on the windows, Some of our teachers were clearly terrified. Miss Ditton ordered lessons to be suspended, and we all assembled in the school hall for morale-boosting hymn singing. "Now thank we all our God," was gratefully chorused as the storm passed over and left us unharmed. On the way home from school, the rain-washed air smelled beautifully fresh, even in the narrow confines of Portugal Place. School dinners. Dinners were eaten at the exclusive premises of the Pit Club in Jesus Lane. The building had been requisitioned as a British restaurant for the duration of the Second World War. We walked there in an orderly crocodile 2x2, led by a teacher with adult helpers bringing up the rear to ensure that no child wandered off. Dinners cost 5 pence and were paid for in advance on Mondays. We were expected to bring the exact total of 2 shillings 1 pence. Any one of us who offered half a crown, 2 shillings and 6 pence, could expect a severe reprimand because 5 pence change would have to be found. The food was usually a chewy stew, followed by soggy ginger-flavoured pudding and custard. Unappetizing, tediously repetitive, but probably very nourishing. There was no choice, and no one was allowed to leave food uneaten, no matter how hard it was to digest. The rule was, take what you are given and be grateful. In later years, the school hall was used, the food being delivered by van from the kitchen of a larger school. The quality was much the same, but at least we had some additional time to enjoy the freedom of Jesus Green before afternoon lessons. However, we were strictly forbidden to go near Grove Ditch or the river, lest we should fall in. The 2 brick-built air raid shelters in the corner of the green near the school were also forbidden territory, having become the unsavoury homes of tramps and strange men. Teachers. Miss Chesterton was lovely. She came from South Africa and held us spellbound with accounts of the beauties of the Veldt and Table Mountain. The lively antics of the rickshaw boys in the streets of Cape Town were particularly enthralling. Some boys thought it would be nice to marry her, if only she would wait for them to grow up. However, she had other ideas and left to marry someone else, even older than a top-class boy. If she could be likened to a graceful yacht sailing serenely through the warm, sunny waters of the southern oceans, her replacement, Miss Fulbourn, summoned images of a battleship going into action in the icy storm-lashed waters of the North Atlantic. Any child unfortunate enough to come within range without a valid excuse could expect a deadly salvo. Handwork lessons were particularly stressful. Once we were each given a rectangle of blue sugar paper. It's very expensive, so take care not to spoil it. What we were expected to make remained a mystery. Measurements were ordered to be made down and across, using rulers so ink-stained that the gradations were mostly illegible. Instructions followed to fold and cut, using rusty scissors that had long ago lost their sharpness. Finally, those edges of paper that had not been mistakenly trimmed off were ordered to be pasted together using wartime economy-grade water paste, water being by far the chief ingredient. At the end of the lesson, the ill-formed mess of soggy paper that each of us had produced would have been, we were angrily told, an envelope if only you had followed my instructions more carefully. a very useful object if your mothers should have urgent need of one. Fortunately, my mother had a plentiful supply. Attending school, previously so enjoyable, had become something to dread. Celebrations. The best thing about VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, 8th of May 1945, was that we were given a whole day off school. We proudly wore badges of wartime leaders, Winston Churchill being by far the most popular. King George VI came a poor second, but American Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had hardly any takers. The subsequent half-day off school to celebrate VJ Day, Victory over Japan, was an anticlimax. On a warm, sunny morning in May, Miss Ditton tried to introduce the celebration of Empire Day. A special assembly was convened, at which we sang Red, White and Blue, What Does It Mean to You? With little enthusiasm. Then we filed past the Union flag, gave a scout salute, and were rewarded with sweets handed out by an uncomfortably overheated Father Christmas. The experiment was not repeated. A celebration of a very different kind was the distribution of a consignment of chocolate powder, all the more exciting because it was unexpected. Whether other classes in the school also benefited, I cannot recall, nor can I recall the identity of the donor. But the generosity of people in the USA or the Dominions seems likely. The powder had been carefully weighed into small paper bags, one for each child. We were forbidden to sample the powder in class and were enjoined to take it home to share with families. But little of it got far beyond the school gate. This wonderful bounty was recalled with relish for a long time afterwards. In 1948, the university installed the popular South African leader, Field Marshal Jan Smuts, as Chancellor. We were given a half-day holiday and told that it was our patriotic duty to join the crowds to see the great man pass by. But the procession was disappointing because the mighty warrior I had expected to see turned out to be a man of modest stature, almost invisible among a forest of maces worn by officials and the ornate regalia of university and civic dignitaries. Far more impressive was the spectacle of our teacher, Miss Grove, hanging onto the railings of Holy Trinity Church and cheering with wild abandon. I stared in disbelief until our eyes fleetingly met. Her face fell and she stopped cheering. Uncertain how to react, I moved on among the crowd, feeling embarrassed and guilty because I had spoiled her enjoyment. Playground life. "Give me a tanner for it," said George, who had a mouth organ that made the most melodious sounds. I longed to possess it, and sixpence seemed a reasonable price, so I became the proud owner. I discovered that sound could be produced by inhaling as well as exhaling, provided one didn't mind imbibing the debris left by previous owners. The general election of 5th of July 1945 was contested in the school playground. Boys from top class demanded to know the political allegiance of younger children, who were then herded on opposite sides of the playground, Labour facing Conservative. The boys enthusiastically told us that because it was an election, we were at liberty to trade insults before coming to blows. Most of us opted for Labour, and probably because it was easier to say than Conservative. But there was no appetite for abuse or violence, so that initiative failed. The boys' lavatory abutted onto the playground wall, the urinal part being unroofed. Some older boys thought it would be fun to pee over the top of the wall, a feat easier to accomplish after they had swallowed as much water as possible from the nearby drinking fountain. When sudden and unexpected showers fell in the playground, the lady teachers were outraged, and the offenders, I was not one of them, were dealt with very firmly. New ideas. In the next class, we were in charge of Miss Grove, a bright and purposeful young lady fresh out of Homerton Teachers' Training College and full of new ideas, to which older members of staff paid keen, if sometimes dubious, attention. Regimented drill exercises were replaced by physical training, while percussion and Marian Richardson handwriting were added to our curriculum. For percussion, we were issued with small drums, tambourines, triangles, and cymbals. I hoped for a drum, but was given a tambourine, which I disliked. There was no choice and no opportunity to try another instrument. As Miss Grove thumped ta-tiddly-ta-ta on the piano, we counted the bars and responded with bang, ting, rattle, clash, observing rests, crescendos, diminuendos, trills, and repeats, as dictated by the single line of music. Any form of self-expression was strictly forbidden. Having achieved reasonable proficiency, we were invited to give a demonstration to trainee teachers at Homerton College on a Saturday afternoon. I could think of more enjoyable ways of spending my time, and the promised reward of tea and buns was disappointing. Before progressing to Miss Grove's class, we had made a start with joined-up handwriting. Evenly formed loops and curves, thin strokes upwards and thicker strokes downwards, all slanting gracefully forward. I was proud that my efforts were occasionally amongst those pinned up over the fireplace as an example of good work. However, this achievement was brought to an abrupt end by the forced introduction of the Marian Richardson style of handwriting. Up and down strokes of variable thickness and forward slanting letters were forbidden, and loops regarded with horror. It seemed an insultingly babyish style, and I deeply resented it. My handwriting was never recovered. Some of Miss Grove's new ideas were more enjoyable, as she attempted to arouse our interests in the world beyond school. She took us for nature walks across Jesus Green, pointing out the peeling bark of plane trees and the wild untrimmed vegetation growing inaccessibly on the far side of Grove Ditch. Other walks led through the colleges and around the backs. She told us that these were famous places, much more pleasant surroundings in which to grow up than the grim, smoky factories that were a feature of her North Country upbringing. The magnificent scenery of the Scottish Highlands was invoked with the aid of a wind-up gramophone on which Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture was played. "Can you hear the seagulls calling?" she asked hopefully. "Yes, miss," we enthusiastically responded, although few of us had heard a real seagull. Listening to the gramophone was far more enjoyable than sums or spelling. Top class. Our top class teacher was Mrs. Grantchester. She was unfailingly calm and wise, unable to command our attention and respect without ever raising her voice. She read installments of Heidi and Black Beauty to great effect. Less enjoyably, we became proficient in reciting much of the Catechism, especially the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and the 10 Commandments, although the meaning of the one about adultery was hastily glossed over. With even greater facility, we chanted the multiplication tables and recited the pence table to a fast staccato rhythm. 12 pence, 1 shilling, 20 pence is 1 and 8 pence, 24 pence is 2 shillings, 30 pence is 2 and 6 pence, 36 pence is 3 shillings, 40 pence is 3 and 4 pence, 48 pence is 4 shillings, 50 pence is 4 and 2 pence, 60 pence is 5 bob. Stop! Interjected Mrs. Grantchester, putting on her best, deeply shocked expression. 5 bob indeed? Who said it? There was hardly any need to ask, because only Jimmy would have had the nerve, and he had turned bright red as he realized the enormity of his indiscretion. Begin again, she ordered. So off we went, even faster than before. When we got to 60 pence, we enunciated 5 shillings with great clarity, lest we should lose our playtime. Mrs. Grantchester allowed herself a fleeting smile of satisfaction. On the first day of term, we had been told where we were to sit. There was no choice. How our places had been allocated was not explained. I had to share a desk with Frida. We did not like each other. I would have much preferred to share with Betty, who was on the other side of the classroom, so there was no opportunity to become friends. Our desks were iron-framed and quite immovable. The tip-up wooden seats were very hard, and the lift-up tops of the desk were mostly ink-stained and scarred with the scratches and carvings of former pupils. Each desk had an inkwell at the top right-hand corner. There was no concession to left-handed pupils. We were encouraged to regard the inside of the desk at which we sat as our personal and private domain, to be kept in an orderly and tidy fashion. Even to look at the contents of the desk of another classmate was considered to be an unwelcoming intrusion into a neighbour's privacy. I was surprised to receive an invitation to Vera's birthday party. She sat in the same row as myself, but several desks behind. I didn't want to go, but my mother insisted. Out of politeness, she said. When I arrived at the party, I was amazed to find that I was the only guest. I discovered that Vera had no interest in aeroplanes, racing cars, steam engines, football, or the largest ocean liners afloat. So mutually stimulating conversation was difficult. However, her mother had prepared a very nice tea, so all was not lost. How boys and girls were to relate to each other was not discussed, and any kind of gender education was scrupulously avoided. The nearest we got to receiving an understanding of human reproduction was the provision of a small fish tank perched on a windowsill in the school hall. With meaningful looks, we were urged to observe how life begins by watching the development of frog spawn into tadpoles and froglets. Any possible connection between frogs and human reproduction was not explained. After several weeks, there was keen competition to be allowed to take the froglets to Grove Ditch for disposal. There were no male teachers on the staff to provide role models for the boys. We did not play football or cricket because it was considered unseemly for females, even those fresh out of training college, to engage in such unladylike activities. Lessons were rarely amusing. As with the exercise of choice, any form of levity was considered to be associated with decadence. During a history lesson, Mrs. Grantchester told us about the lives of monks and nuns. "Do you know the name of the place where monks lived?" she asked. "A monkey house," retorted the irrepressible Jimmy. Delighted uproar followed, in which Mrs. Grantchester could not help but join. A moment to savour. New ideas included the formation of a school choir. I managed to get myself excluded by consistently growling when auditioned. So while my classmates were chirruping about lasses on Richmond Hill and other uninteresting songs, I was allowed to read quietly by the aid of brilliant electric light that had recently been installed. School was never so good. Last rites. The transition to the single-sex senior schools, for which we had been selected, or in most cases deselected, prompted a mixture of eager anticipation and apprehension. There were no preliminary visits to our new schools, so we relied on hearsay reports of what to expect. Specialist subjects teachers, properly equipped gymnasia, laboratories and workshops were exciting prospects, and how grown up it would be to be addressed by our surnames. As we filed out of the classroom for the last time, Miss Ditton and Mrs. Grantchester shook each of us by the hand and wished us well. It seemed a very adult thing to do. Uncertain of which hand to proffer, we surreptitiously practised amongst ourselves as we awaited our turn to take our leave. Endnotes. The events, people, and circumstances in this account have been recorded as accurately as memory allows after some 70 years, but the names of the pupils and teachers have been changed. Childhood. Early Memories by John Gibson. I was born in South Yorkshire near the end of World War II. My earliest memory is of the air raid shelter that was in the garden being demolished. The next memory is of my first day at school when aged 4. I had decided by lunchtime that I didn't like school, and so I walked home. I was immediately returned by my mother, and the teacher told me to sit at the front of the class so as to be easily observed. This I didn't mind, as I was nearest to the coke-burning stove that was the classroom heating. When we reached the 3rd year at school, I remember standing in lines and chanting our times tables. We went all the way from 2 2s are 4 to 12 12s are 144. This learning was vital to a lifetime's use of mental arithmetic. As a toddler, I remember being washed before bed by sitting on the kitchen draining board and having feet in the sink. This, presumably, was because hot water was in short supply. We must have been quite dirty, as South Yorkshire was a coal mining and burning area, and so soot was everywhere. Neighbours were often mine workers, and they received large coal deliveries as part of their wages. This was tipped onto the footpath by their front gates, and we sometimes helped to barrow it around to the coal store at the back. The coalman came to the non-mining houses. He'd carry the 100-weight sacks on his shoulder from his lorry round to the back of the house. The dustbin man did a similar job in reverse. He'd hoist the metal bin full of all waste, no recycling in those days, and carry it round to the lorry. He'd also return the empty. Some other services were provided by horse and cart. Greengrocery was done this way, and I remember that there was also a barrel of vinegar, from which our own bottle could be filled. One day, the horse became ill on our street and had to be shot. Then there was a wait until the knacker's van arrived, and the horse was dragged into it. Brington's tea was also delivered by a very smart two-wheel horse-drawn cart. Corner shops provided the rest of our food, apart from the butchers. You needed a weekly trip into town. I remember chunks of butter being patted into shape before wrapping. Food rationing was still in force, so sweets were in short supply. Just a few were available as a weekend treat. Our street ended in open country, and so, with a few friends, I would disappear into a landscape of meadows, dikes, and lakes. Our parents had no idea where we were or what we were doing. We just returned for meals. There were willow trees by the dikes, and a favourite activity was to climb to the top, wrap our arms around a bunch of weeping branches, and slide back to earth. If a lake was frozen, we would play a rudimentary ice hockey. Fortunately, we could see where the ice was thin, and no one ever went through. One day, while building a den, we uncovered what to us was a hoard of coins. The value was actually about 6 and 11 pence, about 35p. We took this to the local police station, which was a shed in a neighbour's garden, and the sergeant took us seriously. We were told that if it was unclaimed after a certain time, we could have it back. This happened, and we probably had enough each to buy a special treat. Dad was a railway worker, and like other shift workers, had plenty of daylight hours in which to be a keen gardener. We had 2 big greenhouses filled with bedding plants in spring, tomatoes in summer, and chrysanthemums in autumn. The surplus was sold to neighbours, and I was often sent down the garden to pick a pound of tomatoes. These were 10 pence, 5p, a pound. The chrysanthemums were not left to me to pick, as the best were being groomed for the annual show at the local Miners' Welfare Club. So I grew a few myself and managed to win the novices class for one of the football-sized flowers that are rarely seen these days. Televisions, telephones, refrigerators, etc. were rare on our street. The nearest neighbour with a television invited several families to cram into their front room and watch the coronation of Elizabeth II. Emergency telephone calls had to be done via another neighbour. One of the refrigerator owners used to sell homemade lollipops for a penny, or was it threepence? Although radios were common, it was interesting to try and build a crystal radio. I remember using the garden's very long wire clothesline as an aerial to try and boost the signal. By the time I was old enough for senior school, I became a paper boy, so as to earn pocket money of 14 shillings per week, 70p. This involved getting up at 6 o'clock, 7 days a week, and delivering papers and magazines from a heavy bag. Fortunately, my bike could take some of the weight as the load became heavier when Sunday supplements arrived. Unfortunately, on snowy mornings, the bike wouldn't go round corners without skidding and throwing me off. After a quick breakfast, it was time for the walk to catch the school bus. On returning home on Thursdays, I had to do the round again to deliver the local weekly paper. I stopped delivering when I left school, and the wage had increased to 16 shillings, 80p. Childhood over.
Memories of a Yorkshire Childhood by Anne Jerram. When I was aged 4, my dad got a job in Leeds. It was 1946 and the North was a new venture for the family. Our 3-bed semi in a hilly residential area was near Roundhay Park, and I thought it was rather unfair that the people on the other side of the road had not just attics, but basements too. We had a forest at the end of the road where we played a lot, though it turned out to be a small copse when we revisited several years later. An early memory was seeing my baby brother put outside in his pram on a snowy day and left to sleep, as was the custom. Eventually, his shrieks drew my mother out to find that a roof slip had completely covered him and the pram in snow. Aged 6, a group of us children would walk to school together. The world seemed full of birds and flowers then. The school was an old one with almshouses attached either side, where we sometimes bought apples for a penny from the residents. There were only 2 teachers. One was the headmaster, who took the top 4 classes, and the other teacher took all the infants. The pupils together must have numbered around 50. Winter was a trial because the toilets were across a snowy yard and, needless to say, totally unheated. Milk arrived in small bottles which were stood near the fire to warm. This made it a disgusting mix of warm, then cold, then lukewarm in patches, but there was no opportunity to avoid drinking it. Lunch was delivered in large metal containers, which were cool by the time they arrived. Puddings were very stodgy, there being no fresh fruit for most of the year. I tasted my first banana and orange, aged 9. Having no alternative, we usually ate the meal and surplus went to the local farm for pigs. In summer, we went on nature walks and were taken swimming to an open-air pool in Roundhay Park. Climbing out shivering, we could sometimes get Mum or Dad to let us have 6 old pence to buy a gorgeous hot Horlicks. The back garden had been used for growing vegetables during the war, and Dad kept up the tradition, so we learnt the rudiments of seasons and planting. Summer brought the family out more to investigate wonderful countryside, Ilkley, Otley, and hills named Cow and Calf, and many more. My dad was a car enthusiast, and we eventually got a tiny Hillman, which he would tinker with every weekend, usually putting it together just in time as we waited anxiously. Mum's milk jug was vulnerable, though. It was used to fill the radiator, of course, and was left on the running board, flying gracefully away and smashing as the car sped off. Warmer temperatures had their problems too, as we had no fridge. Milk was kept in porous containers like flower pots, standing in water to keep it cool. Cooking was done on what was called the range, and plenty of guesswork went into its use. Over the winter, many foods were stored by bottling and drying. We kept eggs in isinglass, and on one sad occasion our kitten fell into the bowl and needed much washing, but I have a vague memory that it did not survive. My memories of that time are happy because we had such freedom, playing in Roundhay Park, streams and woods, unaccompanied for seemingly endless hours, playing games, music and singing programmes broadcast by the BBC, and activities such as maypole dancing were fun for us. We probably ate too much fish and chips, but of course had no sweets, and the only media was a radio. Many of these memories will be similar for listeners, many very different, but I hope it will remind some of you of a post-war era and a different way of life. Weekends at Grandma's by Sue Jiggins. I often reflect on my childhood years and realise just how much I enjoyed visiting and staying at my grandma's and granddad's bungalow in the quiet and rural location situated in Over in Cambridgeshire. The reason for my regular visits were because my mother very sadly developed cancer of the spine in her 30s when I was only 3 years old. And at that time my father was working as an architect and was in the process of setting up his own office in King's Parade, Cambridge. At that time, a nanny was appointed to look after me during the week, and at weekends sometimes, along with my grandparents. As I got older, I would nearly always go to Grandma's, and my cousin would be there as well. Robert was very close in age to me, so we both had a good time at her home. These 2 days were the highlight of my week, and we did things we couldn't do at home. Grandma was a very organised person and extremely good at baking cakes, so much so that when she finished baking them, and she made several at a time, I hasten to add, she would leave them on the worktop to cool down and planned to ice them later and add the decorations as the final touch. Her instructions to us were not to touch the cakes as they were cooling down. Unfortunately, these instructions fell on deaf ears. My cousin came up with the nickname Tranty for Grandma, but we don't know why she was given that name, other than it was a loving name for her. Anyway, Grandma would then leave the kitchen, and little did she know we were quietly lurking around the corner waiting for her to disappear. I would then nip into the kitchen with Robert, and we would cut a slice out of each cake, and there were probably about 4 of them, and hastily eat them, but only if we could see she was in the garden. If not, we would wrap them in some napkins and sneak off as quickly as possible and lock ourselves in the bathroom to indulge these delightful and tasty cakes. Grandma, understandably, was not too pleased by this, but as she was a lovely and kind-hearted person, she forgave us, although it was my idea and I was the mischievous one. There were several activities that Grandma would ask us to do, but as Robert and I were rather naughty, we would always come up with an idea to make the activity more fun. This would include climbing up her tall apple trees, as she had an orchard, picking the apples off for her to make apple crumbles. Instead of taking a short time to collect each basket, we would spend several hours picking a basket and then would stay at the top of the tree eating them, and none would be picked for her. Consequently, poor Grandma would have to wait hours to make her crumbles and probably ended up completing them in the evening. Another naughty activity of mine was to walk over her newly laid and beautiful crockery full of pretty and unusual flowers. Although I was only walking on the rocks, not the flowers, Grandma was rather nervous as she imagined her delightful rockery would be spoilt. On one occasion, I did accidentally tread on a rather special plant and damaged it. She came out and inspected the rockery on this occasion and immediately took me by the hand and led me to the bathroom, where she locked me in. But unknown to her, I managed to unlock the bathroom window, which was high up, and after some thought as to how I could climb out, I stood on the cistern and clambered out of the small window and hid in the garden. There was no end to my naughtiness, as the next episode will tell you, but in the meantime I did behave myself some of the time. One outing Grandma took us on was to Woolworths in St Ives by train every Saturday, and we would really look forward to this treat. On arrival at Woolworths, Grandma would give us a small but equal amount of money to spend in this shop. She would then go to the hardware shop to look around and leave us to choose a selection of crayons, sharpeners and rubbers, and of course a magic painting book, which, with just a pot of water and a brush, displayed various interesting pictures. On arrival home, we would sit in front of a glowing fire and paint pictures from our books. Grandma would make tea with cake, if there was any left, and bring it all through on a trolley, while at last she could sit and relax and read her papers in peace. Nature's Bounty. This is not a story I really wish to enlarge on, but I will. At the age of around 7 years old, we were living in Thornton Road, with a garden backing on to Mr. Runciman's house, the vet, which later became the Felix Hotel. Well, our neighbour's house had a wooded area directly behind their garden, which led to Mr. Runciman's large garden over a small wooden bridge with a stream running below. Our neighbours had children the same age as me, a boy and a girl, and we would frequently play with each other, sometimes in their garden and sometimes in mine. We always enjoyed ourselves in many ways, so this was just one of the things we did. We soon discovered that we could get across to this garden, so we all decided to try at the old wooden gate to see if it would open, and to our delight it did. I, being the ringleader, cautiously tiptoed into the huge but well-stocked and immaculate gardens and beckoned the other children to follow. We all crept quietly along the gravelled pathway to the enormous house. The others stood at the entrance by the steps, but I couldn't wait for a moment, so quickly ran up the steps to the front door. I stood for a second listening, then turned round to check no one was looking, and silently turned the huge door handle to open the heavy oak wood door. On gaining entry to the hallway, I slowly walked in, found the kitchen, and walked into the pantry. I spotted a box which I thought looked as though it could be biscuits, and opened it. To my surprise and delight, it was filled with delicious chocolate biscuits. I hurriedly put my hand in there and took out as many as I could, and stuffed my pockets full. At that point, I again cautiously looked and listened to check no one was in sight, and quickly got out of the house, running down the steps 2 at a time to meet the others. We all ran back along the path, and as I was in front, I picked as many flowers as I could that were lining the gravelled pathway, which looked stunningly beautiful, of course, before I picked them. Upon reaching the large wooden gate to get back to our house, we suddenly and unexpectedly heard a man shouting at us to get out. On turning around, I noticed it was the gardener, with a garden fork raised above his head, looking extremely angry at me. I continued running as fast as my legs would carry me, and climbed over the fence and into my neighbour's garden. On second thoughts, I then realised to my horror that my luck had run out. He knew where we lived. I didn't honestly think he would take this matter any further, so decided to give the freshly picked flowers to our neighbour's mother, who was unaware of all that had happened, and thanked me for the lovely flowers, and promptly placed them in a vase on her dining room table. Surprisingly, no questions asked. Not long afterwards, there was a knock at her front door. I froze in horror. What can I do or say now? I thought to myself. She opened it to be told the news I was dreading. She was horrified and banned me from seeing her children for a week. The flowers were immediately removed from the vase and thrown away. At this point, I realised I was in big trouble, a hard lesson learnt from then afterwards, although the gardener never found out that I stole all the biscuits.
My Experiences by Andrew West. We lived in a block of flats in East London that were built around 1880. We rented a 2-bed version. When I say we, I mean the family, because we left there in the late 50s and moved out to the suburbs. The flats were well built, but were a world away from what one would expect of them today. For example, the front door opened straight into the front room, and there was no hot water. Heating was from coal fires in each room. Needless to say, we had only one going in the winter. That was in the front room. We did not call it the lounge. That was too posh. It was about 10 feet by 5 feet. There was no bathroom. Bathing was done in the kitchen with hot water boiled on the cooker. Consequently, we each had around 4 inches of water in the bath. In spite of 200 flats in the street, there were only 3 cars parked there, and one of those was driven by a chauffeur. We had no telephone. Hardly anybody did. In our block, there were 10 flats, and only the widow in the flat below had a phone. I remember my dad asking her once if he could use it. She agreed. There was good neighbourliness and pride in the flats, and each family took it in turn to clean their section of the staircase once a week. We had happy days there. My mother worked in the typing pool of the local pharmaceutical company called Allen and Hanbury's. My father drove a lorry for a coal merchants who are still in business today. I went to the local infant or primary school, which was in the same street. There were no supermarkets in those days, but the main road, Bethnal Green Road, was around the corner and was full of local shops. It was also a street market every day. We had 3 cinemas within walking distance, and a local coach company could take you away to the seaside or the country.
I Disliked Milk with a Passion by Audrey Longdon. I was born in Ely in 1929 and was one of 6 children in my family. I was just 8 years old when my father was killed in a road traffic accident. He'd been in the army during World War I and was an ardent member of the British Legion, meeting his friends there and helping out at their club on Saturday nights. It was about midnight on a Saturday, when he was returning home after helping to clear up at the club, that he was knocked down by a car as he crossed the road on a pedestrian crossing. On the morning after his accident, I remember my mother taking us children 2 by 2 and telling us about his death. I clearly remember that my younger sister and I sat on my mother's lap, one on each knee, while she explained what had happened to my dad. What a task that must have been for her. Mother, left alone with 6 children, all under the age of 12 years old, couldn't go out to work because we were so very young. This left her with very little money available to bring us children up. She didn't have money, but what she did have was all the love in the world, which she freely handed out to us children. This all happened before World War II had started, and there was no child benefit or other handouts from the government at that time. The source of her money was from a small widow's pension from my father and from some compensation that had been paid to her by the car driver that knocked my father down. She was, however, able to put good meals on the table, and I always had enough to eat, although my hungry, growing brothers sometimes moaned that they could have eaten a little more. That's boys for you. During World War II, there were no school dinners, so we had to walk home for lunch. Our school was in Silver Street in Ely, and we lived in High Barnes. The distance between the 2 streets was just over a mile. We walked to school in the morning, then home for lunch, and back to school before finally walking home for tea, a total distance of about 4 miles. I remember we played marbles and skipped on the way back and forth to school, and if it rained, we got wet. During one winter, the snow was so deep it came over the top of our Wellington boots, and we couldn't go to school. Winters were much colder during that period of my life. We made huge snowmen and were allowed to throw snowballs in the school playground. There was no health and safety rules preventing us from doing that in those days. One very cold winter back then, when we did not have central heating or double glazing, I can remember we could write our names in the frost on the inside of our living room windows. I was very small in stature during my young life, and I disliked milk with a passion. My teacher at school thought that drinking milk would help build me up, and in those days all school children were given 1/3 of a pint of free milk each day, usually in the morning, to be drunk through a straw. The milk came in crates and was quite often, during winter, the crates would be left outside and their contents could freeze. The frozen milk would expand in the bottles and would be forced out, lifting the bottle tops and allowing the blue tits to have a good old meal from the exposed cream, without having to break through the round cardboard lids. One day, the teacher thought I should drink my milk and cajoled me until I drank it. I was immediately sick and, thank goodness, never again had to drink school milk. I still don't like milk, but I do have some in my tea. At home, we didn't have a radio as such, but we had a relay system that allowed us to listen to 2 or 3 different radio programs. The programs were picked up by a relay house and then sent directly to us by a system of wires. My sisters and I liked listening to music and radio shows like Itmar, Round the Horn, Billy Cotton, and other like programs, but the boys would always be listening to the cricket or Dick Barton's Special Agent, so we had little chance to listen to our choices. We did enjoy other things though, and we were very lucky one day when one of our friends, who worked at the nearby St. Martin's jam factory, managed to acquire a thick rope for us. Boxes of oranges arrived at the factory ready to be made into marmalade, and the boxes were bound with thick rope, which our friend brought to us. We used that rope for skipping, with someone on each end turning it, and a group of 10 or more of us in the middle jumping up and down. In those days there was not much traffic about, and we usually had the rope across the road, with the skippers in the middle. During the 1946-47 winter, there was a huge flood all along the River Ouse, and we used to go down to Springhead Lane at Ely to the Cresswells, an area where, in medieval times, watercress was grown in natural springs that were there at the time. From there we could see a vast area of floodwater that was the highest it had been for years. My mother did a grand job for her family, and I'm sure she would have loved listening to my and others' stories today. It was a great childhood, and our family is still a very close one. Each one of my brothers and sisters, there were 3 girls and 3 boys in the family, had children. One had 3 children, and the rest had 2 each. They've all done very well for themselves, and we find ourselves with 5 doctors in the family. I am so very proud of all of them. I Went Missing by Yvonne Garrard. My earliest memory is of my sister Sheila in her pram. There's a photo of my sister in her pram in the local park. I'm sat on my mother's knee between my grandparents. They lived with us, and they told the story of the day I went missing. My mother had gone to the local cottage hospital to give birth to my sister. I made my own way there to find my mother. I knew the way to the local cottage hospital because I used to go there with my mother for her regular prenatal appointments. There were no telephones then. I was taken back home by one of the nurses. I Led Donkeys on the Beach by Jane Reed. From the age of 1 to 17 years old, 1951 to 1967, I lived in St Andrews, Fife, with my family. My father, a medical consultant, my mother, an accomplished cellist, my older brother and sister, and from 1959, my younger brother. From the age of 7 until about 9 years old, I spent about 6 weeks of each summer holiday leading the donkeys on the beach with my best friend, Beetle. She was given this nickname by her father as she crawled sideways as a baby and peered out from beneath a thick fringe. I still call her this today. We worked hard leading the donkeys all day and every day, and enjoyed a gallop home at the end of the day to the donkeys' field by the dunes. We both just loved it, never tiring of what some might seem like a repetitive job. The donkey business was owned by a Romany family headed by Harry and Violet. They took good care of us, always providing us with a shilling at lunchtime for a tasty, but very greasy, Scottish pie. It sustained us well. I had occasional pleas from my mother to come home for lunch. Home was only a 10-minute walk up the hill, but the staidness of a domestic lunch had no appeal compared with the freedom and fun of a lunch on the beach. My overall memory of those days on the beach was of great contentedness, with the added thrill of a gallop home, though one day we were chased by a herd of bullocks and literally only just made it to the gate. It was a bit too thrilling. As a child, you don't analyse why you particularly enjoy a particular activity, you just live it. But looking back, I think there were several elements to the experience that made it so rewarding. I was with my best friend, so had good companionship with someone I knew well. And Harry and Violet were trusted members of the local community and were well organised and took good care of us. We felt secure. I remember spending quite a lot of time in silence, sitting in the sand, waiting for my next customer, enjoying the sand between my toes, the gentle breeze, the freshness of the air, the sun on my face, and the seascape. I felt competent in leading my charges and looking after my donkey. I enjoyed seeing each child's pleasure in taking the ride. We donkey leaders were part of a cohesive group, and then, of course, there was the thrill and freedom of the gallop home. In a way, this childhood experience has formed the basis of what I have endeavoured to achieve in life. I've always been interested in making a positive contribution to community life, whether it was running a woodcraft folk group for 4 years for 50 children, providing yoga classes for 20 years, running a Quaker Sunday school for 90 children for about 10 years, and now providing an introduction to haiku and a support and meditation group, both at present on Zoom. In all these activities, I've endeavoured to work in a harmonious way, thus bringing out the best in people. The valuing of silence has also been very important, a thread in my life. Becoming a Quaker in 1976 and training in meditation practice for the last 20 years. Somehow, all of this was encapsulated in my donkey leading experience, a sort of experience that has become the foundation stone of my life. In adult life, I learned that there were deeper aspects to this childhood experience. Prior to my working with Harry, he'd been a patient of my father's, and the treatment he was provided with may have actually saved his life, or at least greatly improved its quality. So the whole experience of working for him was underlaid by gratitude and trust. Once I knew this part of the story, my whole memory of these times deepened.